Hi guys! Tonight we explore the quiet, almost invisible beginnings of a land that would one day be called Persia and later Iran. You find yourself standing on a vast plateau where the air is thin and dry and the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. The ground beneath your feet is rough, scattered with stones warmed by a sun that feels both distant and relentless. There are no cities yet, no empires, only land silence and the slow rhythm of early human life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, you might want to share where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. It is always fascinating to imagine listeners scattered across different nights, different continents, all drifting into the same quiet story. Now dim the lights, and you begin walking. The land around you is not empty even if it appears that way at first glance. Small groups of humans move carefully across this plateau following water sources, animal paths and seasonal patterns. This region known today as the Iranian Plateau has long been a crossroads between worlds. To the west, fertile valleys connect to Mesopotamia. To the east, open routes stretch towards Central Asia. To the south, harsh deserts guard the approach to warmer seas. One widely accepted historical understanding tells us that humans have lived in this region for tens of thousands of years, adapting slowly to its demanding environment. Evidence of early settlements, tools and cave dwellings suggests that this land was never truly uninhabited. Instead, it hosted small, resilient communities that learned to survive in conditions that could change quickly and without warning. You notice how everything here depends on balance. Water is scarce but not absent. Seasons shift but not violently. Survival is not about dominance, it is about awareness. People here move with the land, not against it. As you walk, you begin to notice traces of early life. Simple shelters made of stone and brush, fire pits surrounded by darkened earth, tools carefully shaped from flint. These are not the grand monuments of later civilizations, but they hold something quieter, something foundational. They represent the beginning of a relationship between humans and this land that will endure for thousands of years. Yet there is something unusual beneath the surface of this early history. Some researchers question whether the Iranian plateau was merely a passageway for migrating groups, or whether it served as a long-term centre of innovation. The evidence is subtle. Unlike the great river civilizations that would later emerge elsewhere, this region leaves behind fewer dramatic traces. Its story is quieter, harder to reconstruct. You pause for a moment listening. There is no sound of cities, no distant noise of crowds, only the wind moving softly across the plateau, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and distant vegetation. It feels timeless, as though you have stepped outside of history itself. But time is still moving. Gradually these small groups begin to change. They stay longer in certain areas. They return to the same locations season after season. You begin to see the earliest signs of something more permanent. Not quite villages yet, but something close. A pattern of return, a sense of place. Archaeologists continue discussing whether this shift toward semi-settlement happened slowly over thousands of years, or if it occurred in shorter, more concentrated periods of environmental stability. Climate plays a quiet but powerful role here. When conditions are slightly more favourable, people stay. When they are not, movement resumes. You walk toward a shallow valley where a small group has gathered. They are working together, sharing tasks, watching the land carefully. There is no written language yet, no formal structure of power. But there is cooperation. There is memory. There is the beginning of culture. And perhaps most importantly, there is identity, even if it is not yet defined in words. You begin to sense that this land is shaping the people who live on it. The need to adapt, to endure, to observe carefully becomes part of who they are. Life here does not allow for carelessness. Every decision matters. Every resource is noticed. This quiet shaping will echo far into the future. It is easy from a modern perspective to imagine that history begins with cities, with kings, with written records. But standing here, you realize that something much deeper is already forming. A relationship between humans and a land that demands patience and resilience. You continue walking, and the landscape begins to shift slightly. The terrain rises, then flattens, then dips again into another valley. Each variation creates a new set of possibilities, new patterns of movement, new opportunities for survival. Some groups begin to specialize. You notice differences in tools and clothing and the way shelters are built. These are small distinctions, but they suggest something important. Even at this early stage, diversity is emerging. Not a single unified culture, but many small ones, each shaped by its immediate environment. Scholars remain divided about how connected these early groups were. Did they interact frequently, sharing knowledge and traditions, or did they remain largely isolated, developing independently over long periods of time? The answer is not entirely clear. You kneel beside a cluster of stones arranged in a rough circle. At first it seems random, but then you notice the pattern. This is not natural. It's been placed here deliberately. Perhaps for cooking, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for something that cannot be easily explained. There is a quiet mystery in these small details. As the light begins to soften, you feel a sense of stillness settling over the land. The heat of the day fades, replaced by a cooler, gentler air. Shadows stretch across the ground and the sky begins to shift toward deeper colours. You realise that what you are witnessing is not just the beginning of a place, but the beginning of continuity. These early lives, these small choices, these subtle adaptations will not disappear. They will build upon each other layer by layer until something much larger emerges. Much later, this land will be called Persia, later still Iran. But for now, it is simply a place where humans are learning how to exist, how to endure, and how to belong. And as you stand there in the fading light, you begin to understand that history does not begin with empires. It begins here, quietly, almost unnoticed. You continue moving across the plateau as the light of early morning spreads gently over the land. The sky is pale, almost colourless at first, and the air carries a slight chill that will soon disappear. Beneath your feet, the ground changes constantly. Sometimes it is firm and stony, sometimes soft with fine dust that lifts quietly with each step. This land does not offer comfort easily. To your left, distant mountains rise in long uneven lines, their peaks faintly touched with lingering snow. To your right, the terrain opens into dry plains that seem to stretch without end. Between them lie valleys where life gathers carefully, where water flows just enough to sustain small clusters of people, animals, and vegetation. This contrast defines everything here. One widely recognized fact is that the Iranian plateau is one of the most geographically varied regions in the ancient world. It contains high mountain ranges, expansive deserts, fertile pockets, and narrow corridors that connect distant regions. This diversity does not just shape the landscape, it shapes how people think, move, and survive. You feel it as you walk. The mountains offer protection but also isolation. The deserts create barriers but also force movement along specific paths. The valleys invite settlement but only temporarily depending on the seasons. Nothing here is permanent. Everything depends on timing. As you move closer to a rocky incline, you notice how carefully people navigate the terrain. Paths are not random. They are remembered, passed from one generation to another. A safe route through a mountain pass is more valuable than any possession. A hidden water source can mean the difference between life and loss. And yet there is something unusual about how this land shapes human behaviour. Some researchers question whether harsh environments like this limit cultural development or actually encourage it. In places where survival is difficult, people must think more carefully, plan more precisely, and cooperate more closely. Difficulty becomes a kind of teacher. You watch as a small group moves along a narrow trail carved naturally into the hillside. They carry simple tools, woven materials, and small bundles of food. Their pace is steady, not rushed, not slow. They are used to this movement. It is part of their life. There is no sense of ownership over the land in the way later societies will understand it. Instead, there is familiarity. Certain places are known, trusted, revisited. Others are avoided, dangerous, unpredictable. As the sun rises higher, the temperature begins to shift quickly. The cool air of morning fades, replaced by a dry warmth that grows steadily stronger. You feel how exposed the plateau is. There is little shelter from the sky, no dense forests to soften the light. The openness is both beautiful and unforgiving. You move toward a narrow valley where a thin stream cuts through the earth. Here life gathers more visibly. Small plants cluster along the edges of the water. Animals come carefully, pausing alert. Humans settle nearby but not too close. They understand the rhythm of the land. Water brings life, but it also brings competition. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these early communities followed strict seasonal migration patterns or whether some groups began experimenting with longer stays near reliable water sources earlier than previously believed. The evidence suggests both may have been true depending on the specific region. You crouch near the stream and watch as someone fills a simple container. The movement is practiced, efficient. Water is not wasted. Every drop matters. There is a quiet discipline here. You begin to notice how this environment encourages awareness of time, not in hours or days but in cycles. The return of certain winds, the appearance of particular animals, the subtle change in the colour of the land. These signals guide decisions. When to move, when to stay, when to prepare. This awareness becomes a kind of knowledge that cannot easily be written down. It is learned through observation, through experience, through repetition across generations. Scholars remain divided about how much of this knowledge was shared between different groups. Did these early communities exchange information when they encountered each other, or did they guard it closely as a form of survival advantage? The answer may vary, but the question itself reveals something important. Knowledge here is as valuable as any resource. You continue walking and the land begins to rise again, leading you toward a higher vantage point. From here you can see the vastness more clearly. The plateau stretches outward, broken only by distant ridges and shifting patterns of light and shadow. It becomes easier to understand how this land could both connect and divide. To the west, routes lead toward fertile river valleys where early civilizations are beginning to form. To the east, open expanses extend into regions that will later become pathways for movement and exchange. This plateau sits between worlds not fully belonging to any one of them, yet influencing all of them in subtle ways. You realize that this position will become important. Much later, this land will serve as a bridge between empires, cultures, and ideas. But even now, in this early time, the potential is already present. The geography is preparing for something larger, even if the people living here cannot yet see it. As the day begins to soften again, you feel the temperature drop slightly. The harsh brightness fades into a warmer, quieter light. Shadows return, stretching across the uneven ground. You walk past a cluster of stones arranged carefully along a ridge. At first, they seem like natural formations, but as you look closer, you notice subtle patterns. Markers, signs, perhaps guiding movement, perhaps indicating something known only to those who placed them. There is intention here, even if its meaning is not immediately clear. You pause and listen again. The wind moves steadily across the plateau, carrying with it fine grains of dust that shift the surface almost imperceptibly. Over time, this land changes not through sudden events, but through constant quiet transformation, and the people who live here change with it. They become attentive, patient, resilient. These qualities will not disappear. They will carry forward, shaping the cultures, the systems of power, and the identities that will eventually emerge from this land. For now, though, everything remains simple. A path through the mountains, a stream in a quiet valley, a group of people moving carefully through a world that offers no guarantees. And as you continue walking, you begin to sense that this land is not just a setting for history. It's one of its earliest architects. You continue forward as the land opens into a broader plain, where the horizon feels closer, more defined, yet still distant enough to remain uncertain. The air is warmer now, and the silence carries a different quality. It is no longer empty. It feels watched, shared, occupied. Small groups begin to appear more frequently. At first, they are scattered. A few individuals moving together, a cluster resting near a water source, another group in the distance barely visible through the dry shimmer of the air. But as you move further, you begin to notice something new. These groups are not entirely separate. Their paths cross, their movements overlap. This is where something subtle begins to change. A widely accepted historical observation suggests that over time, early human groups across the Iranian plateau began forming loose alliances not through formal agreements but through repeated interaction. Shared routes, shared water sources, and shared seasonal patterns gradually brought people into contact with one another. You watch as two groups approach the same valley from different directions. There is no immediate tension, no sudden conflict. Instead, there is caution, a slowing of movement, a careful observation of the other. Then something unexpected happens. They do not avoid each other. They remain. There is a quiet exchange, not necessarily of words in the way you understand them, but of gestures, of objects of recognition. Tools are examined, materials are compared. There is curiosity, not fear. This is one of the earliest forms of connection. You begin to understand that survival here may not depend only on isolation, but also on cooperation. Sharing knowledge about safe routes, water availability, or seasonal changes could increase the chances of survival for everyone involved. Yet this is not a simple process. Some researchers question whether these early interactions were mostly peaceful, or if they involved tension that left little visible trace. Conflict, if it occurred, may not always leave clear evidence. The archaeological record can show tools and settlements, but not always the emotions behind encounters. You walk closer, observing how individuals from each group maintain a careful distance while still engaging. There is an unspoken boundary, but also an openness. It is a balance that feels delicate, constantly adjusting. As the sun begins its slow descent, more groups arrive. Not in large numbers, but enough to create a sense of gathering. A temporary concentration of people in a place that offers resources, safety, and familiarity. You begin to see patterns forming. Certain individuals seem to take on roles. One person signals when to move, another distributes food, another watches the surroundings with steady focus. These roles are not enforced, but they are recognized, trusted. This is not yet leadership in the formal sense, but it is the beginning of structure. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these early forms of organization emerged naturally through necessity, or if they reflect the early stages of social hierarchy. Did certain individuals gain influence because of strength, knowledge, or experience? Or was leadership more fluid, shifting depending on the situation? As you observe, it feels like a mixture of all these possibilities. A person who knows the terrain may lead during travel. Someone skilled in crafting tools may hold importance in another moment. Authority is not fixed. It moves with need. You notice how communication becomes more refined in these gatherings. Gestures grow more precise, sounds become more consistent. Repetition creates familiarity, meaning begins to stabilize. This is how language slowly begins to take shape, not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual layering of shared understanding. You sit quietly near the edge of the gathering, watching as a small group works together to prepare food. The process is efficient, practiced. Tasks are divided naturally. There is no confusion. Everyone seems to understand their role without needing to be told. This level of coordination suggests something important. These people are not just surviving, they are organizing. And with organization comes memory. Traditions begin to form. Certain practices are repeated not just because they work, but because they are known, trusted, passed on. Scholars remain divided about how quickly these traditions solidified into distinct cultural identities. Did groups begin to see themselves as separate from others at this stage? Or did identity remain fluid, defined only by immediate relationships and shared experiences? You look around and sense that identity here is still flexible but beginning to take shape. Small differences become noticeable. Variations in tools, slight changes in clothing, unique ways of arranging shelters or preparing food. These distinctions may seem minor, but over time they can grow into something more defined. You begin to understand how tribes form, not through a single decision, but through repetition, familiarity, and shared memory. As the evening settles, the gathering becomes quieter. The energy shifts from movement to stillness. People sit closer together. Fires begin to glow softly, casting warm light across faces and objects. There is a sense of belonging here, even if it is temporary. You realize that this is one of the earliest moments where humans begin to experience something beyond survival, a feeling kind of connection, of being part of something larger than oneself. And yet this connection is fragile. Tomorrow these groups may separate again, returning to their own paths, their own territories. The alliance is not permanent, it exists only as long as it is needed. Some researchers question whether these early alliances ever became stable enough to form lasting political structures, or if they remained loose and temporary for much longer than traditionally believed. The evidence is not entirely clear. You stand and take a final look at the gathering. The fires flicker gently, the voices are soft, almost blending with the wind. The land around you remains vast, indifferent, but now it feels slightly different. Not empty, connected. These small repeated interactions are quietly building something that will one day become far more complex. Networks of relationships, systems of trust, the beginnings of cooperation on a larger scale. You begin walking again as the night deepens. Behind you, the gathering fades into darkness. Ahead, the plateau stretches on, carrying with it the slow formation of something new. Not yet a kingdom, not yet a nation, but something that is beginning to understand itself. You walk on as the land gradually shifts again, becoming more structured in ways that are subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable. The paths you follow begin to feel less random. Certain routes are used more often. Certain valleys seem more regularly occupied. Movement is still present, but it is no longer entirely free. There is a quiet sense of direction forming. You notice that the gatherings you once saw as temporary are now becoming more consistent. The same groups return to the same places. The same routes are followed season after season. What once felt like scattered human presence now begins to resemble something closer to organization. And within this slow change, a new presence begins to emerge. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that the Medes were among the first to form a recognizable political structure on the Iranian plateau around the first millennium BCE. They were not the first people to live here, but they were among the first to bring together multiple groups under a shared system of authority. You begin to sense how this might have happened. The alliances you observed earlier, once temporary and fluid, start to hold longer. Cooperation becomes more consistent. Agreements are remembered. Expectations begin to form. Over time, these patterns create stability. You walk toward a settlement that feels different from those before it. It is not large, but it is more permanent. Structures are built with greater care. Materials are chosen deliberately. There is a sense that this place is meant to last. People move with familiarity here. They know where things belong, they know each other. There is less caution, less uncertainty. This is no longer just a gathering. It is a community. At the center, you notice a group of individuals engaged in discussion. Their gestures are more deliberate. Others listen. There is a quiet recognition of influence. These are not leaders in the formal sense yet, but they are closer to it than anything you have seen before. Authority is beginning to take shape. Some researchers question whether the Medes formed a unified kingdom as early as traditionally believed, or if what we call their kingdom was actually a loose federation of tribes with varying degrees of cooperation. The evidence is fragmented, drawn from later sources that may reflect interpretation as much as reality. You watch as decisions are made. Where to move livestock, how to distribute resources, when to prepare for seasonal changes. These decisions are no longer made individually. They are shared, coordinated. There is a sense that collective action offers greater security. This is the beginning of governance. You move through the settlement observing daily life. People work with a quiet rhythm. Tools are more refined now. Materials are shaped with greater precision. There is a growing sense of skill, of specialization. Some focus on crafting, others on gathering or managing animals, others on maintaining structures or organizing movement. These roles are not rigid, but they are becoming more defined. You begin to notice something else. Symbols. They are simple, not yet writing in the full sense, but marks that carry meaning. Patterns carved into surfaces. Arrangements that seem intentional. These may represent ownership, identity, or something more abstract. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these early symbols were primarily practical, or if they also carried ritual or cultural significance. The distinction is not always clear. but their presence suggests a growing complexity in thought. You step outside the settlement and look back. It feels anchored, not permanent in the way future cities will be, but stable enough to create continuity. People here expect a return, they expect this place to remain, and with that expectation comes a deeper connection. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where the land opens again into the wider plateau. The contrast is striking. Behind you, structure. Ahead, vast openness. You begin to understand the significance of this moment. The Medes are not simply forming a kingdom. They are changing how people relate to the land and to each other. Movement is no longer the only way of life. Stability becomes possible. And with stability comes memory planning and a sense of shared future. Scholars remain divided about how centralized Median authority truly was. Did a single ruler hold consistent power, or was leadership distributed among various tribal leaders who cooperated when necessary? The idea of a unified Median empire may be more complex than it first appears. You walk along a path leading away from the settlement and notice how it connects to others. Routes begin to form networks, movement becomes more predictable, trade even in its earliest form begins to emerge. Objects are exchanged not just within groups, but between them. Knowledge travels, ideas spread. This land, once defined by isolation and survival, begins to feel connected in new ways. You pause as the light begins to fade again, casting long shadows across the ground. The settlement behind you glows softly with firelight. It feels alive, grounded, present. This is something new. Not yet an empire, but no longer just scattered tribes. A structure is forming. A shared identity, still fragile, still evolving, but real enough to shape what comes next. You realize that this is one of the first moments when the land begins to move towards something recognizable in history. Not just a place where people live, but a place where power begins to gather. And as you stand there watching the quiet life of this early kingdom, you sense that the transformation has only just begun. The patterns you have seen, the alliances, the cooperation, the early leadership are all building towards something larger. Something that will soon rise beyond this plateau. Something that will be remembered. You move forward as the land begins to carry a different kind of energy, one that feels less uncertain and more directed. The settlements you pass now seem connected not physically in every case, but through shared awareness. News travels, stories spread. Names begin to carry weight beyond a single place. And among these names, one begins to stand out. You hear it spoken quietly at first, then more frequently, with a tone that is neither fear nor reverence, but something in between, a recognition that something unusual is unfolding. Cyrus, you continue walking as this presence becomes clearer. The world you have been moving through, shaped by gradual change and slow cooperation, now feels as though it is gathering around a single point. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a current forming beneath still water. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Cyrus the Great emerged in the 6th century BCE as a leader of the Persians, a group living in the southwestern part of the Iranian plateau. Under his leadership, the Persians would rise rapidly, transforming the balance of power across the region. But as you walk through this moment, it does not feel like a sudden rise. It feels like a alignment. You pass through a settlement where people are speaking in low-focused tones. They are not discussing survival in the way earlier groups did. They are speaking of movement, of direction, of something larger than their immediate surroundings. You begin to understand that Cyrus is not simply leading people. He is connecting them. Some researchers question whether Cyrus's success was primarily due to military strength or to his ability to unite different groups through shared purpose and strategic alliances. The evidence suggests that both played a role, but the balance between them remains uncertain. You move closer to a gathering where individuals from different backgrounds stand together. Their clothing varies slightly, their tools are not identical, these are not people from a single tribe, and yet they are not divided. There is a quiet sense of coordination. You notice how decisions are communicated more clearly now. Messages are carried deliberately. Instructions are understood and followed. This is not the loose cooperation you saw before. This is something more structured, more intentional. The idea of unity is beginning to take form. You walk along a path that leads toward a larger settlement, one that feels more active than those before it. Movement is constant. People arrive, others depart, supplies are gathered, organized, distributed. This is preparation. You begin to sense that something is about to happen, something that will move beyond this region and reshape the land around it. As you enter the settlement, you notice how the atmosphere is different. There is focus here. Not tension, but purpose. Individuals work with a shared understanding that extends beyond daily survival. You see a group examining maps not drawn in the detailed way of later civilizations, but represented through memory gesture and simple markings. Routes are discussed, distances estimated, conditions considered. This is strategy. Archaeologists continue discussing whether early Persian expansion under Cyrus was carefully planned from the beginning or if it evolved gradually through opportunity and adaptation. It is possible that what appears as a grand vision in hindsight was in the moment a series of decisions responding to changing conditions. You walk further and notice something else. There is discipline. People move with coordination, tasks are assigned and completed. There is an emerging structure of authority that feels more stable than anything you have seen before. Leadership is no longer fluid, it is recognized. You begin to understand that Cyrus represents a turning point, not because he appears suddenly, but because he brings together everything that has been forming for generations. The resilience shaped by the land, the alliances built through necessity, the early structures of leadership and cooperation. All of it converges here. You step outside the settlement and look toward the horizon. The plateau stretches outward, as it always has, but now it feels different. It no longer seems isolated. It feels connected to something larger, something expanding. You imagine the paths extending beyond this land, reaching into regions that have their own histories, their own systems, their own ways of life. And you realize that those worlds are about to meet. Scholars remain divided about the exact motivations behind Cyrus's early campaigns. Was he driven by ambition, by necessity, or by a vision of order that extended beyond his own people? The sources that describe him are often written later, shaped by memory and interpretation. But as you stand here, the answer feels less important than the effect. Movement begins. Not chaotic, not rushed, but deliberate. Groups set out along the routes you have followed. Supplies move with them. Knowledge travels alongside them. The connections you have seen forming across this land now extend outward, reaching beyond the plateau. You follow one of these groups as they move steadily across the terrain. Their pace is controlled. Their direction is clear. This is no longer migration, it is expansion. And yet something about it feels different from conquest as you might imagine it. There is not only force, there is also integration. You notice how those they encounter are not always displaced or destroyed. Sometimes they're incorporated, their knowledge, their systems, their people becoming part of something larger. This approach is unusual. It suggests a different way of building power. You pause as the sun begins to lower again, casting long shadows across the land. The group continues forward, their movement steady, their purpose clear. Behind them, the plateau remains, carrying the memory of everything that has led to this moment. Ahead, the world opens, and you begin to understand that what is forming is not just a kingdom. It is the beginning of an empire, one that will carry the legacy of this land far beyond its boundaries. You continue walking as the movement you have been following begins to widen, spreading across landscapes that feel both familiar and newly transformed. The paths are no longer just routes of survival or connection. They are becoming lines of expansion, carrying with them people, ideas, and a growing sense of order. The world is opening. You move alongside a group that travels with quiet confidence. Their pace is steady, their direction certain. They are not wandering. They know where they are going and, more importantly, why. This is what makes this moment different. A widely recognized historical fact tells us that under Cyrus the Great, the Persian state expanded rapidly, forming what would become the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. It stretched across vast territories, connecting regions that had once been distant and separate. But as you walk through this unfolding, it does not feel like something sudden or overwhelming. It feels structured. you begin to notice how the expansion is organized. Groups move in coordination, not just advancing but establishing. When they arrive in a new place, they do not simply pass through. They pause, they build, they connect. You follow them into a settlement that has recently come under Persian influence. There is no visible chaos, no sense of destruction. Instead, there is adjustment. Local people continue their daily routines, but now there is something added. A layer of administration, a presence that observes records and organizes. This is how the empire grows, not only by movement but by integration. Some researchers question whether the Persian expansion was always as peaceful as it is sometimes described. While many regions appear to have been incorporated with relatively little disruption, there were likely moments of resistance, negotiation, and conflict that are less clearly recorded. As you move through the settlement, you notice how communication becomes more structured. Messages are carried with purpose. Instructions are consistent. There is an emerging system that allows information to travel across long distances with surprising efficiency. You begin to sense the scale of what is forming. This is not just a collection of lands, it is a network. You walk along a road that feels more deliberate than the paths you followed before. It is wider, more clearly defined. People travel along it with a sense of expectation. They know it leads somewhere important. And it does. Archaeologists continue discussing how early Persian infrastructure developed so quickly. Did the Persians build entirely new systems, or did they adapt and expand upon existing routes and networks? The evidence suggests a combination of both. You pass travelers carrying goods, messages, and knowledge. They move between regions that once felt disconnected, now linked by a shared structure. Trade begins to flow more consistently, resources move where they are needed. This is how stability is created. You pause near a group of administrators who are recording information in simple but organized ways. Lists, counts, observations. This is not yet the complexity of later bureaucracies, but it is the beginning of something similar. A system that remembers, a system that tracks, a system that allows power to extend beyond immediate presence. You realize that this is what makes the Persian Empire different from what came before. It is not only about control, it is about management. Scholars remain divided about how centralized this system truly was. Did the empire operate under tight direct control from a central authority, or did it allow significant autonomy to local regions as long as loyalty was maintained? The answer likely varies depending on the place and time. You continue walking and notice how cultural differences remain visible. Clothing styles vary, languages shift, traditions continue. The empire does not erase these differences. It seems to accommodate them. This approach is unusual. In many parts of the world, power is asserted through uniformity. Here it is maintained through flexibility. You begin to understand how this contributes to stability. People are more willing to accept a system that allows them to remain who they are, while still being part of something larger. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where the road continues outward, connecting to other regions, other communities, other systems. The scale becomes clearer. This is no longer a regional development. It is something that spans continents. You imagine the distances, the time it takes for a message to travel, the effort required to maintain coordination across such vast spaces, and yet it works. Not perfectly, not without challenge, but with enough consistency to create something that feels enduring. You feel the weight of that realization. This is one of the earliest moments in history where a large, diverse region is brought together under a single system that does not rely solely on custom force. It relies on connection. You continue along the road as the light begins to fade again. The landscape around you changes as you move, but the structure remains. Road settlements, communication administration, the same patterns repeated across distance. Behind you, the plateau still exists, carrying the memory of its early formation. Ahead, the empire continues to expand, reaching further into lands that will soon become part of this growing network. And as you walk, you begin to understand that this is not just the rise of power. It is the beginning of a new way of organizing the world. You continue along the road as it stretches steadily across the land, carrying with it not only travelers and goods, but a quiet sense of cohesion. The world around you feels larger now, yet somehow more connected. Different regions, different people, different traditions, all seem to exist within a shared structure that holds them together without forcing them into sameness. You begin to notice something that does not immediately stand out but slowly becomes clear. People are different here, not just in appearance or language, but in belief in custom, in the way they understand the world. And yet these differences are not being erased. They're allowed to remain. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that under rulers like Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire developed a reputation for allowing subject peoples to maintain their own religions and cultural practices. This approach was unusual in the ancient world, where conquered populations were often forced to adopt the customs of those in power. As you walk through a growing settlement, you begin to see how this works in practice. A group gathers near a structure that serves as a place of worship. The rituals performed here are not the same as those in another region you passed earlier. The symbols are different. The sounds, the gestures, the meaning behind them all reflect a unique tradition. And yet there is no interruption, no sign that this practice is being suppressed. Instead, it continues as it always has, quietly existing within the broader framework of the empire. You move further and encounter another group engaged in a completely different set of customs. Their clothing, their tools, even the way they organize their daily life differs from those you just observed. This diversity is not hidden. It is visible, present, and accepted. Some researchers question whether this tolerance was driven by genuine respect for different cultures or by practical strategy. Allowing people to maintain their traditions can reduce resistance, making it easier to govern large and diverse populations. It may not be idealism, but calculation. As you walk, you sense that the distinction may not matter as much as the outcome. The system works. People continue their lives with a sense of continuity, even as they have become part of something larger. You pass by a group of administrators who seem to understand this balance well. They do not interfere with local customs, but they ensure that certain expectations are met. Resources are managed. Communication flows. Loyalty is maintained. This is how the empire sustains itself, not by replacing identity, but by layering over it. You begin to notice how this approach affects the atmosphere of the places you visit. There is less tension than you might expect, less resistance. The presence of authority is felt, but it is not overwhelming. It is integrated. Archaeologists continue discussing how consistent this policy of tolerance was across the empire. While some regions appear to have experienced significant autonomy, others may have faced stricter control depending on strategic importance or local conditions. You walk into a marketplace where goods from different regions are exchanged. The variety is striking. Materials, colours, textures that reflect distant lands now appear side by side. Trade flows more freely because people feel secure enough to participate. This is one of the quiet strengths of the system. When people are not constantly resisting, they can contribute. You watch as a merchant speaks with someone from another region. Their languages are not identical, but they find ways to communicate. Gestures shared, terms of mutual understanding built through repeated interaction. Connection grows. You realize that this tolerance is not just about culture, it is about stability. By allowing diversity to exist within a unified structure, the empire reduces friction. It creates space for cooperation, for exchange, for continuity. Scholars remain divided about how much this tolerance depended on strong leadership. Was it a lasting feature of the system? Or was it closely tied to specific rulers who understood its value? Without consistent leadership, such balance can be difficult to maintain. You continue walking as the sun lowers, casting a soft light across the settlement. The sounds of daily life begin to quiet. Conversation soften, movement slows. There is a sense of calm here, one that feels earned rather than accidental. You think back to the earlier moments you experienced on the plateau, the isolation, the careful survival, the fragile alliances. All of it has led to this, a system that does not eliminate difference but organizes it. You begin to understand why this empire can expand so far without collapsing under its own weight. It does not demand complete uniformity. It allows variation as long as the overall structure remains intact. This flexibility becomes a form of strength. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where the road continues once again into the distance. Travelers move along it with purpose, carrying with them not just goods but ideas, customs, and connections. The empire breathes through these movements. It is not static, it is alive. And as you step forward onto the road once more, you realize that what you're witnessing is not just power in the traditional sense. It is a different kind of order, one that understands that control is not always about force. Sometimes it is about allowing the world to remain itself, while gently guiding it into something larger. You continue along the road as it stretches forward with a quiet certainty, cutting across the landscape in a way that feels intentional, almost inevitable. The ground beneath your feet is more compact now, shaped by repeated travel. The path is no longer just remembered, it is maintained. You begin to sense that this road is more than a simple route. It is a connection. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Persian Empire developed an extensive network of roads, most famously the Royal Road, which linked distant regions across thousands of kilometers. This network allowed messages, goods and officials to move with remarkable speed for its time. As you walk, you begin to feel how this system works. Travelers pass you with a sense of urgency but not chaos. Some carry sealed messages, others transport goods carefully packed for long journeys. There is a rhythm to their movement, a shared understanding that this road connects places far beyond what you can currently see. You notice stations along the route spaced at intervals that seem carefully planned. At each one, fresh animals wait. Supplies are stored. People rest briefly before continuing. These stops are not random. They are part of a larger system designed to keep movement constant. You pause at one of these stations and observe how efficiently it operates. A rider arrives, hands over a message, and within moments another rider departs carrying it forward. The transition is smooth, practiced. There is no delay. This is how information travels, not slowly, not uncertainly, but with a steady, reliable flow. Some researchers question whether the speed and efficiency of this system have been slightly exaggerated in later accounts. While the network was clearly advanced for its time, the exact pace of communication may have varied, depending on terrain, weather, and local conditions. Even so, as you stand here, it is clear that this system is unlike anything you have seen before. You begin walking again, following the road as it winds gently through the terrain. It adapts the land, rising over hills, curving around obstacles, crossing valleys where water flows. It does not fight the environment, it works with it. This design feels deliberate. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the Royal Road was entirely constructed by the Persians, or if it expanded upon earlier pathways that had existed for generations. It is likely that the Persians refined and formalized routes that were already known, turning them into something far more organized. You pass a group of merchants traveling together. Their goods are varied, reflecting distant regions. Fine fabrics, shaped metals, preserved foods. These items move across the empire, connecting places that might otherwise remain isolated. Trade begins to feel less like an occasional exchange and more like a constant flow. You walk alongside them for a while and notice how they speak of distant cities with familiarity. Places you have not seen yet, they describe them as part of a shared world. The road has made these distances feel smaller. Connection changes perception. You realize that this network does more than move goods and messages. It reshapes how people understand space. Places that once felt remote now feel reachable. Regions that once seemed separate now feel linked. The empire becomes not just a territory, but a system of relationships. Scholars remain divided about how much control the central authority had over this network at all times. Maintaining such an extensive system would have required coordination and resources, and it is possible that local regions played a significant role in keeping it functional. You continue walking as the day begins to soften, the light turning warmer, more diffuse. The road ahead glows faintly in the fading sun, guiding movement even as the landscape darkens. You begin to notice how this constant flow of movement creates a sense of continuity. There is always someone arriving, someone departing. The road is never truly empty. It feels alive. You stop for a moment and listen. Footsteps, distant voices, the soft sound of animals moving steadily forward. These sounds blend into a quiet rhythm that echoes across the land. You think back to the early days you witnessed on the plateau when movement was uncertain, When paths were remembered but not fixed, now those paths have become something more permanent, more reliable. They have become structure. You begin to understand that this road is one of the hidden strengths of the empire. It allows coordination across vast distances. It enables response adaptation and control without constant presence. It connects. You continue walking as night begins to fall, the sky deepens and the first stars appear faintly above. The road remains visible, guiding your steps even in low light. Travelers continue moving, some carrying small lights, others navigating by familiarity and memory. The system does not stop when the sun sets. It continues quietly, steadily. This continuity creates a sense of stability that reaches far beyond any single location. You realize that this network of roads is not just a physical structure. It is a reflection of how the empire thinks. Organized, connected, adaptive. And as you follow the road into the deepening night, you begin to sense that every step taken along it is part of something much larger. A system that holds the empire together. A silent thread running across the land, linking distant lives into a shared experience. You continue walking as the road gradually leads you into a place that feels more settled than anything you have seen before. The movement is still there, the quiet rhythm of travelers passing through, but here it slows. People stop. They stay. Life gathers and lingers. You step into a town that feels steady. The air carries the scent of cooked grain, of animals nearby, of earth that has been worked and shaped over time. Structures stand closer together, built with intention, forming narrow paths between them. Nothing feels random. Everything seems arranged to support daily life. This is where the empire becomes personal. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that within the Persian Empire, everyday life varied greatly depending on region, but many communities experienced relative stability compared to earlier periods. This stability allowed agriculture, trade, and local traditions to develop without constant disruption. You walk slowly through the town, observing how people move with familiarity. There is no urgency, no sense of immediate danger. Instead, there is routine. Someone kneels beside a small patch of cultivated land, carefully tending to crops. Another shapes clay into simple containers. Nearby, a group gathers to prepare food, their movements practiced and calm. This is what the empire supports. Not just expansion or power, but continuity. You pause near a family as they sit together sharing a meal. The food is simple, but it is enough. There is a quiet sense of security in the way they eat, in the way they speak softly without concern that something will interrupt them. This feeling is new. Earlier, survival required constant awareness, constant readiness to move. Here, people can remain, they can build something that lasts. And with that comes a different kind of life. You notice how children move through the space, learning by watching, by participating. Skills are passed down not through formal instruction, but through repetition, through presence. Knowledge becomes part of daily routine. Some researchers question whether this sense of stability was equally experienced across all regions of the empire. While some areas likely benefited from consistent governance and access to resources, others may have faced challenges that are less clearly recorded. You continue walking and notice a group of individuals engaged in conversation near a central space. Their tone is measured. They discuss matters that seem to affect the entire community: resource distribution, seasonal planning, interaction with neighboring settlements. Local decision-making still exists. The empire does not replace it entirely. Instead, it layers over it, providing a larger framework within which these communities operate. You begin to understand that daily life is not controlled in every detail. People retain a degree of autonomy, managing their own affairs while remaining connected to a broader system. This balance is delicate. Archaeologists continue discussing how much influence imperial administration had on everyday life in smaller settlements. Did officials intervene frequently, or did they allow communities to function independently as long as certain expectations were met? As you observe, it feels like a quiet partnership. The empire provides structure, stability, and connection. The people maintain their traditions, their routines, their identity. You move toward the edge of the town where a small marketplace is formed. Goods are displayed simply but with care. Items from nearby regions sit alongside those that have travelled long distances. You see materials that do not belong to this landscape. Objects shaped in ways that reflect different cultures. These items carry stories, traces of places far beyond this town. Trade brings the outside world closer. You watch as two individuals exchange goods. There is no rush. They speak, consider, agree. Trust is built through repetition, through shared understanding. This is how networks deepen. You begin to notice how time feels different here, not marked by sudden change, but by gradual continuity. Days flow into each other with a steady rhythm. But life becomes predictable. Predictability creates comfort, but it also creates expectation. Scholars remain divided about whether this stability led to greater social cohesion, or if it introduced new forms of inequality that are less visible in the archaeological record. As systems become more complex, differences in status and access can begin to emerge. You look more closely and begin to notice subtle distinctions. Some structures are larger, some tools are more refined. Certain individuals seem to hold more influence in conversations. These differences are not extreme, but they are present. Changes happen in here as well, just more quietly. You continue walking as the sun lowers, casting a warm light across the town. Shadows lengthen and the pace of movement slows further. People begin to gather in smaller groups, sharing stories, reflecting on the day. There is a sense of closure. You realize that this is one of the most important transformations you have witnessed so far. The empire is no longer just an abstract system of roads, administration, and expansion. It is a lived experience. It shapes how people eat, work, speak, and rest. It allows life to settle. You walk beyond the town and look back as the first signs of night appear. Soft light glows from within the structures. The sounds of activity fade into a quiet murmur. It feels peaceful, and yet beneath that peace there is complexity, a system that must be maintained, a balance that must be preserved. You turn and continue along the road, carrying with you the understanding that the strength of this empire is not only in its scale, it is in the ordinary lives that continue within it. You continue along the road as it carries you away from the quiet rhythms of daily life and back into the wider structure of the empire. The landscape shifts once more, opening into long stretches of land where movement feels purposeful, directed not by survival alone, but by something more controlled. You begin to sense how power operates here. Not loudly, not constantly, but steadily. Steadily. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Persian Empire maintained control over vast territories not only through military strength but through administrative organization and strategic governance. Instead of relying on constant warfare, it developed systems that allowed stability to endure across distance. As you walk, you realize how different this feels from what you might expect. There are no visible signs of continuous conflict, no constant movement of armies. Instead, there is presence without pressure. Authority exists, but it does not overwhelm the landscape. You pass a group of officials traveling along the road. Their movement is calm, measured. They carry records, not weapons. Their purpose is not to fight, but to observe, to maintain, to ensure that the system continues to function. This is a different kind of control. You follow them into a settlement where their arrival does not create fear but attention. People gather not to resist, but to listen. Information is exchanged, updates are given, expectations are clarified. There is structure here. Some researchers question whether this image of peaceful administration overlooks moments of tension or resistance that are less clearly documented. It is possible that conflict existed, but was managed in ways that did not disrupt the overall system. As you observe, it becomes clear that the empire does not need to assert power constantly. Its strength lies in predictability. You notice how resources are tracked. Supplies are accounted for, movement is recorded. These actions may seem simple, but they create a network of awareness that extends across the empire. Nothing is entirely unknown. You begin to understand that this awareness allows for control without constant intervention. Problems can be addressed before they grow. Adjustments can be made without disruption. This is how stability is maintained. You walk through the settlement and notice how life continues alongside this administrative presence. People work, trade, and gather as they did before. The officials do not interfere unless necessary. Their role is to support the structure, not to dominate it. This balance is delicate. Archaeologists continue discussing how much autonomy local leaders retained under Persian rule. In many cases, existing systems of leadership were preserved as long as they aligned with the broader expectations of the empire. You watch as a local leader speaks with one of the officials. Their interaction is calm, almost collaborative. They exchange information, discuss conditions, and agree on what needs to be done. This is not a relationship of simple command. It is coordination. You begin to see how this reduces the need for force. When local systems are integrated rather than replaced, resistance becomes less likely. People continue to follow familiar structures even as they become part of something larger. Scholars remain divided about whether this approach was consistently applied across all regions. Some areas, particularly those of strategic importance, may have experienced more direct control while others were given greater freedom. You continue walking and notice how the absence of constant conflict creates space for development. Roads are maintained, trade continues, communication flows. Energy is not consumed by war, it is directed toward stability. You pause and consider how unusual this is. In many parts of history, power is maintained through continuous assertion through visible displays of strength. Here, power is quieter. It exists in systems, in processes, in relationships. It does not need to be constantly proven. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where the road continues once again into the distance. The same pattern repeats: movement, communication, coordination. The empire sustains itself not through constant expansion but through consistency. You begin to understand that this is one of its greatest strengths. It does not collapse under its own size because it does not try to control everything directly. It allows for variation, for local management, for adaptation. This flexibility creates resilience. You think back to the earlier moments you experienced when survival depended on careful observation of the land. That same awareness now exists on a larger scale. The empire observes itself, adjusts itself, maintains itself. It has learned. You continue walking as the light begins to fade once more, the sky softening into evening. The road remains steady beneath your feet, guiding you forward through a system that feels both vast and carefully balanced. And as you move deeper into this world, you begin to sense that this way of maintaining power, quiet, structured, and adaptive, will shape how this empire is remembered, not just for what it conquered, but for how it endured. You continue along the road as it leads you toward lands that feel subtly different, not in the shape of the terrain, but in the atmosphere that surrounds it. The air carries a new tension, one that is quiet at first but noticeable. The movement of people becomes more cautious. Conversations are softer, more measured. You are approaching a boundary, not a physical line drawn across the land, but a meeting point between worlds that have begun to notice each other. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that as the Persian Empire expanded westward, it came into increasing contact with the Greek city-states, independent and often competitive communities scattered along the eastern Mediterranean. These encounters would shape how both sides understood each other for generations. You move closer to a coastal region where the land meets the sea. The air changes here, carrying a faint scent of salt. The horizon is no longer just land stretching outward, but water extending into the distance. This is new. You watch as ships move slowly across the surface, their shapes different from anything you have seen before. They glide with purpose, connecting distant shores in ways that mirror the roads you have followed across land. This is another kind of network. You begin to notice how the people here differ from those on the plateau. Their clothing, their language, their gestures all reflect a distinct way of life. They are organized differently, governed differently, thinking in ways that feel unfamiliar, and yet they are now connected. Some researchers question whether the early interactions between Persians and Greeks were primarily hostile from the beginning, or if they began as exchanges of trade and cultural contact before tensions grew. The evidence suggests that both cooperation and conflict existed side by side. You walk through a coastal settlement where merchants from different regions gather. Goods are exchanged, ideas shared. There is curiosity here, a sense of discovery as people encounter ways of life beyond their own. But beneath that curiosity, there is also caution. You hear conversations that carry a different tone than before, words spoken carefully, observations about differences, questions about intentions. This is how tension begins, not through sudden conflict, but through awareness of difference. You watch as a group of Persian officials meet with local leaders. Their interaction is polite, structured, but there is a subtle distance between them. Each side understands that they are not the same, and that their systems do not align perfectly. This creates uncertainty. Archaeologists continue discussing how local Greek communities responded to Persian presence in different regions. Some appear to have cooperated, accepting integration into the empire, while others resisted, seeking to maintain their independence. You begin to see how this variety of responses creates complexity. The empire that has been able to expand through flexibility now encounters societies that value autonomy in a different way. The balance that worked across the plateau becomes more difficult to maintain here. You walk along the edge of the settlement, where the land meets the water, and pause to watch the waves move gently against the shore. The rhythm is steady, but beneath it lies a vast, unpredictable depth. It feels symbolic. Two worlds are meeting. Mating, one built on broad integration on systems that connect diverse regions, the other built on smaller independent units, each with its own identity, its own sense of control. You begin to understand that this meeting will not remain peaceful forever. Scholars remain divided about how much misunderstanding influenced the growing tension between Persians and Greeks. Differences in political structure, cultural values, and perception may have played as much of a role as direct competition for power. You turn back towards the settlement and notice how activity continues, but with a heightened awareness. People observe each other more closely, movements are slightly more guarded. The atmosphere has shifted. You realize that this is one of the first moments where the empire encounters a challenge that cannot be easily absorbed through flexibility alone. Not all systems can be integrated without friction. Some resist, some push back. You begin walking again, following a path that leads along the coastline. The sound of the sea stays with you, a constant presence that feels both calming and uncertain. Behind you, the empire remains structured, connected, stable. Ahead, something new is forming. Not yet conflict, but the conditions that will lead to it. And as you move forward, you sense that the quiet balance you have been observing will soon be tested in ways that cannot be managed through administration alone. You continue along the coastline as the tension you sense begins to take a clearer shape. The air feels heavier now, not because of the sea, but because of expectation. Movements are more deliberate. Messages travel faster. The quiet coordination you have seen throughout the empire begins to focus in a new way. This is no longer just contact. It is confrontation waiting to unfold. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the series of conflicts known as the Greco-Persian Wars would become one of the defining moments in how Persia was perceived by the wider world. These wars did not happen all at once, but developed through a sequence of events shaped by resistance, response, and escalation. You walk toward a gathering where Persian forces prepare not in a chaotic rush, but with the same structured calm you have seen before. Supplies are organized. Routes are planned. Communication flows steadily between groups. There is no panic, only readiness. You begin to notice how different this preparation feels from the movement of traders or administrators. The purpose is sharper, the direction more fixed. Yet even here the sense of order remains. You follow as the movement begins. Groups advance across the land following routes that have already been established. The same roads that carried goods and messages now carry something else. The system adapts. Some researchers question whether these campaigns were driven primarily by the need to maintain control over rebellious regions or by a broader ambition to extend influence further west. The motivations may have shifted over time, shaped by both necessity and opportunity. You move closer to the edge of a battlefield, though it does not feel like what you might expect. There is no constant noise, no immediate clash. Instead, there is waiting, positioning, observation. Both sides study each other. You see Greek forces forming in their own structured way, compact, coordinated, relying on close formations and collective movement. Their approach contrasts with the broader, more expansive organization of the Persian forces. Two systems, two ways of understanding power. You begin to understand that this is not just a conflict of armies, it is a meeting of perspectives. Archaeologists continue discussing the details of specific encounters such as Battle of Marathon, where smaller Greek forces achieved unexpected success against a larger Persian army. The exact reasons for these outcomes remain a subject of analysis, including terrain tactics and leadership decisions. You stand at a distance as movement begins to shift into action. Lines advance, positions change. The quiet anticipation gives way to controlled motion. Even here, the structure remains. Commands are followed. Units move with purpose. There is no chaos, only intensity held within discipline. And yet something begins to change. The confidence you sensed earlier and the steady expansion now encounters resistance that does not easily yield. The system that has worked across vast territories meets a form of opposition that requires a different response. You begin to feel how this alters perception. For the first time, the empire is not expanding. It is being challenged. Scholars remain divided about how much these conflicts affected the internal stability of the Persian Empire. While the wars are often remembered as major turning points, the empire itself continued to function and expand in other regions. But something else happens here. You step back from the immediate movement and listen not to the sounds of conflict, but to the stories that begin to form around it. Narratives emerge. Accounts are told, remembered, repeated. The Greeks describe these encounters in ways that emphasize resistance, independence, and victory against a larger force. These stories travel shaping how Persia is understood far beyond the battlefield. You begin to realize that this moment is not only about what happens in the land, but about how it is remembered. Perception begins to shift. You walk along the edge of the conflict as the light begins to fade, the intensity softening into the quiet that follows. The movement slows. The immediate actions give way to reflection, to interpretation. You sense that the outcome of these encounters will not be measured only in territory or control. They will be measured in memory. You think back to the earlier strength of the empire, its ability to integrate, to adapt, to maintain stability. That strength still exists. It has not disappeared. But now it is being seen through a different lens. Some will view it as power, others as threat, and these differing views will shape what comes next. You turn away from the shoreline and begin walking inland again, following a path that leads back into the broader structure of the empire. The roads remain. The systems continue. But something has shifted. The quiet confidence has been touched by uncertainty. And as you move forward, you begin to sense that the story of Persia will no longer be told only from within. It will also be told by those who stood against it. You walk inland again, leaving the coastline behind as the sound of the sea fades into memory. The land returns to the familiar patterns of roads, settlements, and quiet order. At first, it feels as though nothing has changed. The empire continues to function. Trade flows, life moves forward. But something is different. It's not in the structures or the roads. It is in the stories. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that much of what later generations would understand about Persia comes from Greek sources, especially from writers like Herodotus. His accounts, along with others, shaped a lasting image of the Persian Empire that would influence how it was remembered for centuries. You begin to notice how these stories travel, not as direct records of events, but as interpretations, as narratives shaped by perspective. What one side sees as order, another may describe as control. What one experiences as integration, another may call domination. You pass through a settlement where travelers gather, exchanging news from distant regions. Their conversations carry fragments of these stories. Words shift slightly with each telling. Details are emphasized or softened depending on who speaks. This is how memory forms. Not fixed, but evolving. Some researchers question how accurate these early Greek accounts truly are. While they provide valuable insights, they are often shaped by cultural bias, political context, and the need to create compelling narratives. The image of Persia that emerges may reflect as much about the Greeks as it does about the Persians. You sit quietly near a group as they speak of distant events. You hear descriptions of vast armies, of powerful rulers, of encounters that feel larger than life. There is admiration in some voices, caution in others, and in some a quiet sense of opposition. You begin to understand that the empire is no longer defined only by what it does. It's also defined by how it's described. You walk through the settlement and notice how these narratives begin to influence perception. People who have never seen the Western regions begin to form opinions about them. They imagine the Greeks, they imagine the conflicts, they imagine the outcomes. The empire becomes a story as much as a structure. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of Persian history has been filtered through external perspectives due to the limited survival of Persian written records from this period. What remains is often reconstructed through the accounts of others, creating an incomplete and sometimes unbalanced picture. You move toward a gathering place where an elder speaks to a small group. His voice is calm, measured, carrying authority not through force but through experience. He speaks of the empire not as a distant power, but as a living system that connects people across vast distances. His words feel grounded, less dramatic, more reflective. You begin to sense the difference between internal understanding and external narrative. Inside the empire, life continues with structure and stability. Outside stories begin to shape its image in ways that may not fully capture its complexity. Scholars remain divided about how much these external narratives influence the eventual decline of the empire's reputation. While the empire itself continued to function for generations, its image in the wider world was already being shaped in ways that emphasized conflict and contrast. You walk further and notice how these stories travel along the same roads you have been following. The network that connects the empire also carries its image outward. Information moves quickly, but so does interpretation. This creates a kind of echo. Events happen in one place. Their meaning spreads in another. You begin to understand that power is not only about control of land or resources, it is also about control of narrative. And in this moment, that control is not entirely in Persian hands. You pause at the edge of the settlement and look out across the plateau. The land remains steady, unchanged in its form. The roads continue to connect distant regions. The systems still function, but the way the empire is seen is beginning to shift. You think back to the early days when identity was formed through shared experience, through proximity, through direct interaction with the land and with others. Now identity is also being shaped by the stories told across distance by voices that may never have seen the places they describe. This adds a new layer of complexity. You continue walking as the light begins to soften once more, the sky transitioning toward evening. The world feels quieter again, but beneath that quiet there is movement. Not of armies or goods, but of ideas, of interpretations, of memory. And as you move forward, you begin to sense that this shift, this subtle change in how Persia is understood, will have lasting effects. The empire will continue, but its story will no longer belong only to those who live within it. You continue walking as the road carries you deeper into the empire, away from the places where stories are told from the outside and back toward the heart of what still exists. The land remains steady. The systems continue. Life moves forward with the same quiet rhythm you've come to recognize, and yet something is approaching. Not suddenly, not loudly, but with a presence that feels different from anything before. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the 4th century BCE, a Macedonian king named Alexander the Great began a campaign that would lead to the rapid collapse of the Persian Empire. His movement across the land would be swift, decisive, and unlike the gradual expansion you've been following. But as you walk through this moment, it does not feel inevitable. It feels distant. You pass through a settlement where daily life continues without interruption. People work, trade, gather, and rest. The empire still functions. The roads remain active. Communication flows. There is no sense here that something vast is about to change. Some researchers question whether the Persian Empire was already weakened internally before Alexander's arrival, or if the speed of his success was primarily due to his own strategy and leadership. The balance between internal strain and external force remains uncertain. You continue along the road and begin to notice small changes. Not dramatic, but present. Messages travel with slightly more urgency. Officials speak with a tone that carries a hint of concern. Movements are more deliberate, as though the system is adjusting to something not yet fully visible. You feel it in the air, a quiet shift. You follow a group of travelers who speak in low voices about distant regions where conflict has begun. Their words are careful, not exaggerated, but they carry weight. Something is moving across the land. You begin to understand that this is different from previous challenges. This is not a localized resistance. It is a force that continues forward. Archaeologists continue discussing how the Persian administrative system responded to Alexander's advance. While the empire had strong structures in place, the speed and coordination of the invasion created challenges that were difficult to manage across such vast distances. You walk through another settlement and notice how people listen more closely when news is shared. There is still calm, but it is attentive. The stability you have observed is not broken, but it is being tested. You begin to sense how large systems respond to sudden pressure, not with immediate collapse, but with adjustment. You follow the road as it leads toward a region where the atmosphere becomes more focused. Movement increases. Groups gather with purpose. The quiet rhythm of daily life gives way to preparation. You see Persian forces organizing not in chaos, but in the same structured way you've seen before. Supplies are arranged, positions are considered, communication flows. The system holds, but the pace is different now. Faster, more urgent. Scholars remain divided about whether the Persian leadership underestimated Alexander, or if the rapid sequence of events simply outpaced their ability to respond effectively. The sources provide different interpretations, each shaped by a perspective. You walk alongside a group as they move toward a place where a confrontation is expected. The land feels tense, not through noise, but through anticipation. The quiet you've grown used to is still there, but it is sharper now. You stop at a distance and observe. The Persian forces are vast, organized, supported by the systems you have seen across the empire. They carry the weight of everything that has been built over generations. And yet the force approaching them is different, focused, concentrated, moving with a speed that does not allow for slow adjustment. You begin to understand how this moment is unlike those before it. The empire was built through integration, through gradual expansion, through the ability to adapt and absorb. This challenge does not allow for that. It moves too quickly. Some researchers question whether the outcome of these encounters was determined by strategy, by leadership, by morale, or by a combination of all these factors. The exact balance remains uncertain. You step back and feel the scale of what is happening. This is not just a battle. It is a turning point. The systems that have maintained stability across vast distances now face a force that does not operate within those same patterns. You think back to the early days on the plateau when survival depended on adaptation. That same principle applies here, but the conditions are different. The time to adapt is shorter. The pressure is greater. You begin to sense that the empire, for all its strength, may not be able to adjust quickly enough. You turn away as the light begins to fade, the land settling into the quiet that follows preparation. The outcome is not yet fully visible, but the direction feels clear. Something is changing, not gradually, but rapidly. And as you walk into the deepening evening, you carry with you the understanding that the world you have been following is about to shift in a way that cannot be easily reversed. You continue walking as the quiet tension you felt begins to settle into something more defined, something that no longer lingers at the edge of awareness but moves steadily into the center of it. The roads remain, the settlements still stand, but the rhythm you have come to recognize has changed. It is no longer steady, it is breaking. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the decisive encounters between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius III led to the rapid collapse of Persian imperial power. Battles such as Gaugamela reshaped control of the region in a remarkably short period of time. But as you move through this moment, it does not feel like a sudden ending. It feels like unraveling. You walk through a settlement that still carries the structure of the empire, but something is different. The flow of communication is uneven. Messages arrive late. Instructions change. The certainty that once guided movement is no longer fully reliable. You begin to sense how large systems respond when their connections are strained. not with immediate disappearance, but with fragmentation. Some researchers question whether the Persian forces were truly unprepared for Alexander's strategies or whether internal divisions weakened their ability to respond effectively. The empire was vast, and coordinating across such distances under pressure may have introduced challenges that are difficult to fully reconstruct. You continue walking and notice how people begin to speak in quieter, more uncertain tones. The confidence that once defined their movements is replaced by hesitation. Not fear, but something close to it. A loss of clarity. You pass a group of officials attempting to organize a response. Their actions are familiar structured, but there is a delay between decision and execution. The system is still present, but it no longer moves as smoothly as before. You realize that this is not simply about defeat in a single place. It is about disruption across the entire network. You move further along the road and notice how some routes are less active. Travelers are fewer. Stations that once operated with precise timing now feel uncertain. The rhythm has been interrupted. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of the empire's collapse was due to military defeat versus the breakdown of administrative coordination. Without reliable communication and control, even strong systems can begin to weaken. You walk toward a larger gathering where news is being shared. The words carry weight now, not just reports of movement but of loss, regions falling out of coordination, leaders uncertain of the next step. And within these conversations, a name continues to surface. Darius. You begin to understand that the presence of leadership, once a source of stability, is now part of the uncertainty. Movement is constant. Decisions are made under pressure. The center no longer holds the same clarity it once did. Scholars remain divided about how much Darius III was able to effectively manage the empire during this period. Some accounts suggest difficulty in maintaining cohesion, while others emphasize the overwhelming nature of the challenge he faced. You step away from the gathering and look out across the land. It is still the same land, the same plateau, the same roads stretching in the distance. But the meaning of these structures has changed. They no longer represent seamless connection. They reveal where the system is breaking. You begin walking again, following a path that feels less certain now. The direction is no longer guided by a stable network, but by fragments of information by shifting conditions. You notice how some communities begin to adapt quickly, adjusting to new realities. Others hold on to the old structure, uncertain of how to move forward. This creates variation. Change does not happen evenly. Some researchers question whether the transition from Persian to Macedonian control was experienced as a sudden rupture or as a gradual shift in many regions. The experience likely differed depending on location, with some areas adjusting quickly while others face prolonged uncertainty. You walk into a space where new authority begins to appear. Not fully established, not yet integrated, but present. The signs are subtle. Different symbols, different expectations, a new layer forming over what still exists. This is how transition begins, not with complete replacement, but with overlap. You pause as the light begins to fade, casting long shadows across a land that now feels both familiar and changed. The empire you've been walking through has not disappeared entirely, but it is no longer what it was. You think back to the early moments on the plateau when everything was forming slowly, when identity was fluid, when systems had not yet solidified. Now that solidity has been disrupted, and something new is beginning to take shape. Not immediately clear, not yet defined, but present. And as you continue walking into the quiet of the evening, you begin to understand that this is not just the end of something, it is the beginning of a transformation. You continue walking as the land settles into a quieter state, one that feels less defined by a single power and more by overlapping layers of influence. The structures of the old empire are still visible, the roads still stretch across the land, and the settlements continue their daily rhythm. But the certainty that once held everything together has softened. The world is shifting again. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, control of the region passed into the hands of successors to Alexander the Great, eventually forming what is often called the Seleucid Empire. This new system carried elements of Greek culture into lands that had long been shaped by Persian traditions. But as you walk through this moment, it does not feel like a complete replacement. It feels like layering. You move through a settlement where familiar patterns continue. People still tend to crop-shape materials, gather in small groups. The rhythm of life remains steady. But now there are subtle additions. New styles of architecture appear alongside older forms. Different ways of organizing space begin to emerge. You notice how some structures reflect influences from distant regions, their shapes and proportions distinct from what you have seen before. These changes are not overwhelming. They exist quietly, blending into what is already there. Some researchers question how deeply Greek influence penetrated daily life across the region. While urban centres may have adopted new cultural forms, more visibly rural areas likely retained much of their earlier traditions. You walk further and encounter a gathering where people speak in multiple languages. Some words are familiar, others are not. Communication adapts, combining elements from different cultures. This blending feels natural, not forced. You begin to understand that identity here is becoming more complex. It is no longer defined by a single tradition, but by the interaction of many. Archaeologists continue discussing how this cultural blending affected social structures. Did it create new forms of hierarchy, or did it allow for more fluid identities that moved between traditions? As you observe, it feels like both. Some individuals adopt new customs more readily, especially those involved in administration or trade. Others remain closely connected to older practices, maintaining continuity with the past. You walk toward a central space where officials gather. Their clothing and symbols reflect a mixture of influences. The authority they represent is different from what you saw before, but it's not entirely unfamiliar. The system has changed, but it still relies on structure. You notice how governance continues to operate through established patterns. Records are kept, decisions are made, communication flows. The framework built by the Persians has not disappeared, it has been adapted. This continuity is important. Scholars remain divided about how stable the Seleucid system truly was across such a vast and diverse region. Maintaining control required balancing different cultural expectations, which could create tension beneath the surface. You walk along a road that feels both familiar and new. It follows the same path as before, connecting the same regions, but the people who travel it now carry different influences. Their goods, their language, their ideas reflect a world that is expanding beyond previous boundaries. You realize that this is not just a continuation of what came before. It is a transformation. You pass through a marketplace where objects from different traditions sit side by side. Items shaped in Greek styles alongside those rooted in Persian craftsmanship. The contrast is visible, but it does not create division. Instead, it creates variety. You watch as people interact with these objects, choosing what fits their needs, their preferences, their identity. This is how culture evolves, not through sudden change, but through gradual adoption. You pause and reflect on how the earlier strength of the Persian Empire, its flexibility, its ability to integrate different cultures has left a lasting impact. Even under new leadership, that approach continues to shape how this region adapts. Some researchers question whether this continuity was intentional or simply the result of practical necessity. Managing such a large and diverse area requires systems that allow for variation. You continue walking as the light softens once again, casting a gentle glow across the land. The atmosphere feels calm even as change continues beneath the surface. The old empire has fallen, but its influence remains. It lives in the roads, in the system, in the ways people interact, trade, and govern. You begin to understand that history does not move in clean divisions. It flows. One system becomes another. One identity blends into the next. And as you walk forward into this layered world, you sense that the story of Persia is not ending. It is becoming something new. You continue walking as the blended world around you begins to settle into something more defined again. The layers of influence that once overlapped now start to separate, forming clearer identities, clearer boundaries, and clearer lines of power. The quiet merging gives way to contrast. You move across the land and begin to sense a new presence, rising not sudden but steady. It does not arrive with the force of rapid conquest, but with persistence, with a gradual reclaiming of something older. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the weakening of the Seleucid system, a new power emerged in the region known as the Parthian Empire. This state, rooted in Iranian traditions, would re-establish a form of local control while engaging in long and complex interactions with another growing force to the west. You begin to feel that presence as you walk. It is quieter than the expansive systems you have seen before, but no less significant. The structures are less uniform, less centralized, but they carry a sense of familiarity as though something once lost is returning. You pass through a settlement where the influence of earlier Persian traditions becomes more visible again. Clothing styles shift. Language patterns lean back toward what feels rooted in the land itself. Customs that had blended now begin to emphasize continuity. This is not a rejection of what came before. It is a rebalancing. Some researchers question whether the Parthians intentionally sought to revive earlier Persian identity, or if this return to local traditions happened naturally as centralized Hellenistic control weakened. The distinction is difficult to define, but the result is clear. The region is becoming Iranian again in its character. You continue walking and notice how governance feels different. It is less tightly structured than the systems you observed under the Achaemenids. Authority is present, but it is distributed. Local leaders hold significant influence and coordination happens through relationships rather than strict control. This creates flexibility, but also complexity. Archaeologists continue discussing how the Parthian system managed to maintain cohesion across such a wide area, with a relatively decentralized structure. The balance between local autonomy and broader unity remains a subject of study. You walk toward a gathering where leaders from different regions meet. Their interaction is not rigid, it is negotiated. Decisions are discussed, adjusted, agreed upon through conversation rather than command. This is a different form of power. It relies on cooperation rather than strict hierarchy. You begin to notice how this affects daily life. Communities feel more connected to their local identity, yet still part of a larger system. The empire exists, but it is not always visible in the same way. It is felt through relationships. You continue along a road that carries traces of earlier systems but now feels less controlled. Movement is still present, but it is more varied. Different groups travel for different purposes, not always coordinated by a central authority. The rhythm is less uniform, more organic. You begin to sense how this change prepares the region for something new, not through expansion, but through interaction. Scholars remain divided about how much of Parthian strength came from its ability to adapt to different conditions versus its strategic positioning between major powers. Its location placed it between eastern regions and a growing force in the west. You begin to feel the western presence more clearly now. It approaches not quietly, but with a distinct identity, a system that differs sharply from what you have been observing. You walk towards a region where tension gathers again, not as sudden conflict, but as ongoing interaction. The Parthians and this Western power do not simply meet once, they encounter each other repeatedly across time, across space. A relationship forms, one defined by rivalry. You watch as traders, envoys, and soldiers move along shared routes carrying not only goods, but information, perception, and strategy. The interaction is constant, not limited to moments of conflict. This creates familiarity and tension. Some researchers question whether this long rivalry with Rome strengthened Parthian identity by defining it in contrast to an external power. The presence of a consistent rival can shape how society understands itself. You begin to see how this works. The Parthians are not just governing land. They are positioning themselves within a larger world, a world where multiple powers exist, interact and influence one another. You walk along the edge of this interaction, feeling the quiet pull between two systems that do not fully align. The land between them becomes a space of movement, negotiation and occasional conflict, but also exchange. You realize that this period is not defined by a single dominant force, but by balance. A balance that shifts, adjusts, holds, and sometimes strains. You continue walking as the light begins to fade once more, casting long shadows across a land that has once again found a new form of identity. Not the unified structure of earlier empires, not the blended influence of recent past, but something in between, flexible, resilient, and deeply connected to its roots. You continue walking as the balance you have been observing begins to shift once again, slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. The flexibility of the Parthian world, its loose structure and negotiated authority, begins to give way to something more defined, more deliberate. The land feels as though it is gathering itself. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the 3rd century CE, a new power emerged from within this region known as the Sasanian Empire. This empire would seek not only to govern, but to revive and reshape the identity of what had once been Persia. As you walk, you begin to feel that shift. It's not subtle in the same way as before. It is intentional. You pass through a settlement where changes are more visible. Structures are built with greater uniformity. Symbols appear more frequently repeated in ways that suggest shared meaning across distance. There is a sense that identity is being defined, not just expressed. You notice how authority is becoming more centralized. Leaders hold clearer positions. Decisions flow more directly from a recognized center. The flexibility of the Parthian system begins to tighten into something more structured. This is a return, but also a transformation. Some researchers question whether the Sasanian rulers consciously sought to restore the traditions of earlier Persian empires, or if they were creating something new that drew inspiration from the past while adapting to present conditions. You continue walking and observe how governance now carries a stronger presence. Officials move with defined roles. Systems are reinforced. Expectations are clearer. There is less ambiguity. You begin to sense that this clarity brings strength, but also rigidity. Archaeologists continue discussing how the Sasanian state organized its administration and how effectively it maintained control across diverse regions. Evidence suggests a more centralized approach compared to the Parthians, but the exact mechanisms remain complex. You move toward a central space where people gather around a structure that feels important, not just practically, but symbolically. The design is deliberate. The space invites attention, reflection, and participation. Here you begin to notice another shift: religion. It is no longer just one aspect of life among many. It's becoming central. You observe rituals performed with precision, repeated in consistent ways across different regions. Symbols associated with belief appear alongside those of authority. The two begin to intertwine. You begin to understand that belief is becoming part of governance. Scholars remain divided about how deeply this integration of religion and political power influenced daily life. While it likely provided a strong sense of shared identity, it may also have introduced new forms of control and expectation. You walk further and notice how this shared identity creates cohesion. People across different regions begin to see themselves as part of a unified whole, connected not only by administration but by belief. This strengthens the system. It creates a sense of belonging that extends beyond local identity. You continue along a road that feels more controlled than before. Movement is still present, but it is guided more closely. The paths you follow are maintained with greater consistency. The network is reinforced. The empire is becoming more defined. You begin to sense how this clarity affects interactions with neighboring powers. The presence of a strong unified identity creates a more distinct boundary between this empire and others. The contrast becomes sharper. You walk towards a region where this contrast is visible. Interactions with the Western power you encountered earlier continue, but now they carry a different tone. The Sasanian state engages with Rome not just as a flexible counterpart, but as a defined entity with clear identity and purpose. This changes the dynamic. Some researchers question whether this stronger sense of identity intensified rivalry or provided stability by clearly defining roles and expectations. The outcome likely depends on the specific moment and context. You pause and reflect on how far the land has come. From scattered groups shaped by geography, to alliances, to empire, to blending, to balance, and now to definition. Each stage builds upon the last. Nothing's entirely lost. It is transformed. You walk through a settlement where daily life continues under this new structure. People work, gather, speak, and rest as they always have, but now within a system that feels more unified, more intentional. There is pride here, a sense of belonging to something that has been shaped over time. You begin to understand that this moment represents not just the return of Persian power, but the formation of something closer to what will eventually be recognized as a distinct Iranian identity. Not yet fully defined, but forming. You continue walking as the light begins to soften, casting a warm glow across a land that now feels both ancient and renewed. And as you move forward, you sense that this clarity, this strengthening of identity, will prepare the region for the next transformation, one that will come from beyond its borders and change everything again. You continue walking as the strengthened identity of this new empire settles more deeply into the land. The structures are clearer, the authority more visible, the sense of belonging more defined. What once shifted and adapted now begins to hold its shape with greater firmness. And at the center of this firmness, something else takes root: belief. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the time of the Sasanian Empire, a religious tradition known as Zoroastrianism became closely connected to state authority. It was not entirely new, but it was elevated, organized, and woven into the structure of power in ways that had not been seen before. As you walk, you begin to feel how this changes everything. You enter a space where a fire burns steadily at the center of a carefully constructed structure. The flame is not large, but it is constant. It is maintained with attention and care, protected from the wind, watched over by those who understand its meaning. This is not just a ritual, it is a symbol. You observe how people approach the space with quiet respect. Their movements are deliberate, their voices soften. There is a shared understanding that this place represents something beyond the immediate world. You begin to understand that belief here is not separate from daily life. It is part of it. Some researchers question how widely and uniformly Zoroastrian practices were followed across the empire. While it held an important place within the state, different regions may have maintained older beliefs, or adapted in ways that are not fully documented. You step closer and watch as individuals participate in the ritual. The actions are repeated, consistent, carrying meaning that is both personal and collective. These practices connect people across distance, creating a shared identity that extends beyond local traditions. This is how belief becomes structure. You walk through the surrounding area and notice how symbols associated with this faith appear in different forms. Carvings, patterns, arrangements that reflect a shared understanding. They are not overwhelming, but they are present enough to shape the environment. You begin to see how authority and belief support each other. The state reinforces the importance of the religion. The religion reinforces the legitimacy of the state. Archaeologists continue discussing how this relationship influenced governance. Did it create greater unity, or did it introduce new divisions between those who followed different traditions? As you observe, it feels like both possibilities exist. For many, this shared belief creates a sense of belonging, a connection that extends beyond immediate community. For others, it may create distance, a feeling of being outside the central identity. You walk toward a gathering where officials and religious figures stand together. Their roles are distinct but closely aligned. Decisions are discussed, not only in terms of practical outcomes, but also in terms of meaning of alignment with belief. This adds another layer to governance. It's no longer only about managing resources or maintaining order. It is a guiding purpose. Scholars remain divided about how much influence religious authorities held over political decisions. In some cases, their role appears central, in others more limited. The balance likely shifted over time. You continue walking and notice how this integration affects daily life. People organize their routines around shared practices. Certain times, certain actions carry meaning beyond their immediate function. Life becomes structured not only by necessity but by belief. You pause and reflect on how this differs from earlier moments. The empire you first encountered allowed diversity to exist within its structure. Now there is a stronger emphasis on shared identity. This creates cohesion, but also expectation. You move along a road that feels more guided not only by physical direction, but by a sense of purpose. The land itself seems to carry meaning shaped by stories, by belief, by a shared understanding of place. You begin to understand that this moment represents a deepening of identity, not just political, not just cultural, but spiritual. Some researchers question whether this strengthening of shared belief prepared the region for the changes that would come later, making it more resilient, or whether it created rigidity that would be challenged by new ideas. You look ahead and sense that change approaching once again, not from within this time, but from beyond it. You turn your attention back to the present moment and notice how calm it feels. The flame continues to burn. The people move with quiet purpose. The structures hold. There is stability here, but beneath that stability there is still movement. History does not stop. It continues, and as you walk forward into the soft fading light, you begin to feel that this strong, unified identity will soon meet something that will reshape it once again. You continue walking as the structured world around you settles into a steady rhythm, one shaped not only by governance, but by belief, by shared understanding, and by a sense of order that feels deeply rooted. The roads are maintained, the settlements are organized, the identity of the land feels clear. For a moment, everything seems stable. But stability, you begin to notice, is not the same as stillness. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the height of the Sasanian Empire, society became more structured with defined social classes, organized trade networks, and strong administrative systems that supported daily life across the region. You walk into a town where this structure is visible in subtle but consistent ways. The arrangement of spaces reflects purpose, areas for work, for gathering, for worship, for rest. People move within these spaces with familiarity, understanding where they belong, what is expected, how the rhythm of life unfolds. You begin to notice how roles are becoming more clearly defined. Certain individuals focus on governance, others on trade, others on religious duties, others on agriculture and craft. These roles are not entirely rigid, but they are more stable than what you have seen before. This creates efficiency, but also separation. You walk past a group working with metal shaping tools with careful precision. Their skill is evident, developed over time, passed through generations. Nearby merchants exchange goods that have travelled long distances, reflecting a network that remains active and connected. Trade continues to flow. The empire sustains itself through movement and exchange just as it did before, but now with greater organization. Some researchers question how evenly wealth and opportunity were distributed within this system. While the structure allowed for stability, it may also have created differences in status that are not immediately visible in everyday observation. You continue walking and notice how certain individuals hold more influence in conversations and decisions in the shaping of the community. These distinctions are subtle but present. Hierarchy is forming. You move toward a central gathering where people discuss matters affecting the town. The tone is calm, but there is a clear sense of order in how voices are heard. Some speak more than others. Some are listened to more closely. This is how structure deepens. Archaeologists continue discussing how these social layers developed and how flexible they were. Did people move between roles over time, or did positions become more fixed across generations? As you would observe, it feels like a system that allows some movement but also encourages continuity. You begin to understand that stability often comes with boundaries. You walk along a path that leads to a marketplace where goods are arranged with care. The variety is striking, reflecting connections that extend far beyond this region. Materials from distant lands shaped by different traditions now exist within a shared space. This is the result of sustained order. You watch as people interact, negotiate, exchange. Their movements are practiced, their expectations clear. Trust is built not just through personal relationships, but through the reliability of the system itself. This is what makes daily life predictable. Scholars remain divided about how much this predictability benefited all members of society equally. While it created a sense of security, it may also have reinforced divisions that limited certain groups. You continue walking as the sun begins to lower, casting a warm light across the town. The pace of movement slows. People gather, reflecting on the day, preparing for the quiet of evening. There is comfort here, a sense that life will continue as expected. You think back to the earlier times you experienced when survival required constant movement, constant awareness. Now life is shaped by routine, by structure, by a system that holds. This is a different kind of resilience, not based on adaptation alone, but on continuity. You pause and look around, taking in the details. The arrangement of space, the flow of movement, the quiet understanding that connects people within this system. It feels complete. And yet you sense something else, a subtle tension beneath the surface, not visible in daily life, but present in the distance. Some researchers question whether this level of structure made the society more stable or more vulnerable to sudden change. Systems that are highly organized can be strong, but they can also be challenged when new forces disrupt their balance. You begin to feel that possibility, not as an immediate event, but as a distant shift. You turn and continue walking as the evening deepens, the light fading into soft shadows. The town settles into quiet. The structures remain, the routines hold, for now. And as you move forward, you begin to understand that this carefully balanced world is approaching another moment of transformation, one that will not come from within, but from beyond the horizon. You continue walking as the quiet stability of the land begins to feel thinner, almost as if something unseen is pressing gently against it from beyond the horizon. The routines you have observed still hold, the structures remain, and daily life continues with calm repetition. But something is approaching. Not slowly this time, but with momentum. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the 7th century, forces inspired by the new faith of Islam moved rapidly out of the Arabian Peninsula, reaching into the lands of the Persian Empire and bringing profound transformation. As you walk, you begin to sense how different this moment feels compared to earlier changes. There is less time to adjust, less time to adapt gradually. You pass through a settlement where news arrives with unusual speed. The tone is not loud or chaotic, but it carries urgency. People gather more quickly, conversations become focused. The quiet confidence you have felt before is replaced by attentiveness. You begin to understand that this is not just another shift in power. It is a transformation of belief, of structure, of identity. Some researchers question whether the rapid expansion of early Islamic forces was due primarily to military strength or to the weakened state of existing empires after long periods of conflict. The Sasanian state, already strained, may not have been able to respond with the same stability it once had. You continue walking and notice how the familiar systems begin to strain. Communication becomes uneven. Coordination weakens. The clarity that once defined governance becomes harder to maintain. You recognize this pattern. You have seen it before, but this time it unfolds more quickly. Archaeologists continue discussing how the transition from Sasanian to Islamic rule was experienced across different regions. In some areas, change may have felt sudden. In others, more gradual blending old and new practices over time. You walk toward a gathering where new voices are heard. Different words, different rhythms of speech. The message they carry is not only about governance or control, but about belief. A new way of understanding the world. You observe how people respond. Some listen with curiosity, others with hesitation. Some with quiet acceptance. This is how transformation begins, not all at once, but through varied responses. Scholars remain divided about how quickly local populations adopted Islam. While the political shift may have occurred relatively fast, cultural and religious change likely unfolded over generations. You move through the settlement and notice how certain practices begin to change, not immediately replacing what existed before, but existing alongside it. New forms of worship appear. New patterns of organization begin to take shape. This is overlap. You recognize it from earlier moments, but the scale feels larger. The impact deeper. You walk along a road that once carried the structured movement of an empire. Now it carries something different. New ideas, new systems, new expectations move along the same paths. The land remains, but what flows through it changes. You begin to understand that this transformation is not just political. It is cultural, spiritual. It reaches into how people understand themselves, their place in the world, their connection to each other. You pause and reflect on how the strong identity you observed under the Sasanians is now encountering something equally powerful. Not force against force, but belief meeting belief. Some researchers question whether the resilience of Persian culture allowed it to adapt to this new framework rather than disappear within it. The evidence suggests that while many aspects changed, others persisted in new forms. You continue walking as the light begins to soften once more, casting a gentle glow across a land in transition. The structures still stand, the roads still connect, but the meaning behind them is shifting. You feel the weight of that change. It is not loud, it is not immediate, but it is profound. You begin to sense that this moment will reshape everything that comes after. The identity of the land, once rooted in ancient traditions, will not vanish, but it will be redefined. Layered again, you walk forward into the deepening evening, carrying with you the understanding that this is one of the most significant transformations yet, not the end of Persia, but the beginning of something that will eventually be called something else. You continue walking as the transformation you have been sensing begins to settle into the land, not as a sudden replacement, but as a gradual reshaping. The structures remain, the roads still carry movement, the settlements continue their quiet rhythm, but something deeper has changed. The language of belief, of governance, of identity has shifted. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the spread of Islam into this region, Persian lands became part of a broader Islamic world connected to new centers of power and culture that extended far beyond the plateau. And yet as you walk, you begin to notice something unexpected. The older identity does not disappear. It adapts. You move through a town where new forms of architecture stand beside older ones. The shapes are different, the decorations reflect new meanings, but the foundation feels familiar. The land still shapes how people build, how they live. You hear voices speaking in ways that blend older sounds with new expressions. Language begins to shift, not abruptly but gradually. Words are borrowed, adapted, reinterpreted. This is how continuity survives. Some researchers question whether Persian identity was at risk of being fully absorbed during this period, or if its deep roots made it resilient enough to persist beneath new structures. The evidence suggests that adaptation played a key role. You continue walking and notice how daily life reflects this balance. People follow new practices of worship gathering at times that reflect the rhythms of Islam. And yet elements of earlier traditions remain in subtle forms and customs, in ways of thinking, in shared memory. Nothing is entirely lost. It is transformed. Archaeologists continue discussing how this blending of cultures influenced art, literature, and governance. Persian contributions to the broader Islamic world became significant, shaping not only regional identity but the development of the larger civilization. You walk toward a marketplace where goods from across this expanded world are exchanged. The variety is greater than before. Items from distant regions now move through this space with regularity. The network has grown. You watch as people interact, their clothing, their language, their customs, reflecting a mixture of influences. There is diversity here, but it feels connected, part of a larger system that extends beyond the boundaries you have walked. You begin to understand that the land is no longer only part of a Persian system. It is part of something wider, and yet it remains itself. Scholars remain divided about how Persian culture managed to maintain such a strong presence within the Islamic world. Some suggest that its long history and established traditions provided a foundation that could not easily be replaced. You continue walking and notice how knowledge begins to flourish. Centers of learning emerge. Ideas are recorded, shared, expanded. The blending of traditions creates new forms of thought, new expressions of creativity. This is a different kind of strength, not based on political control alone, but on cultural influence. You pause near a group engaged in discussion, their conversation thoughtful, reflective. They speak of ideas of philosophy, of understanding the world in ways that draw from multiple traditions. You realize that this is one of the most important transformations you have witnessed. The identity of the land is no longer tied only to empire. It is tied to culture, to language, to memory. You continue walking along a road that now carries scholars, traders, travelers, all contributing to a flow of knowledge and experience. The empire you once saw has changed, but the connections remain. They have expanded. Some researchers question whether this period represents a continuation of Persian identity under new forms or a complete transformation into something different. The answer may lie somewhere in between. You begin to feel that complexity. The land is not what it once was, but it is not entirely new either. It holds layers. You walk toward the edge of a settlement as the light begins to soften once more. The evening settles gently, bringing a quiet calm that feels familiar even within this changed world. You look back and see continuity in the patterns of life, people gathering, voices softening, the steady rhythm of existence, and you begin to understand that while names may change, while systems rise and fall, something deeper continues, a sense of identity that adapts, absorbs, and endures. You turn and continue walking, knowing that this resilience will carry the land through many more changes yet to come. You continue walking as the world around you becomes richer in sound, in language and expression. The quiet endurance you have been following now begins to take on a new form, one that is not only preserved in memory, but expressed openly through words, through stories, through thought. The land begins to speak differently. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the early Islamic centuries, a new form of the Persian language emerged, often called New Persian, written in the Arabic script, but carrying the deep roots of earlier Iranian languages. This language would become one of the most important carriers of Persian identity. As you walk, you begin to hear it, not all at once, but gradually, in conversation, in gatherings, in recitations that feel both familiar and new. The words flow with a rhythm that reflects something ancient yet shaped by the present moment. You recognize echoes of the past, but also the influence of new structures, new beliefs, new connections. This is not a loss. It is a transformation of voice. Some researchers question how quickly this linguistic shift occurred, and whether it replaced older forms entirely or existed alongside them for generations. Language, like identity, does not change in a single moment. You move through a town where people gather in small groups sharing stories aloud. Their voices carry warmth, depth, and a sense of continuity. These are not official records or administrative messages. These are stories, poetry, memory shaped into form. You sit quietly and listen. The words describe landscapes, emotions, histories that feel both personal and collective. They connect individuals to something larger than themselves, something that stretches across time. You begin to understand that language is becoming a bridge, not only between people, but between past and present. Archaeologists continue discussing how literature and oral traditions preserved elements of pre-Islamic Persian culture, even as new influences shaped the way stories were told. What survives is often layered, carrying multiple meanings at once. You walk further and notice how writing begins to appear more frequently. Texts are copied, shared, studied. Knowledge is no longer only spoken, it is recorded. This changes how ideas travel. They become more stable, more widespread. You watch as a smaller group gathers around a text, reading carefully, discussing its meaning. Their attention is focused, their curiosity active. This is not passive learning, it is engagement. You begin to sense that this is a new kind of power. The power of language, the power of thought. Scholars remain divided about how much of this literary development was influenced by earlier Persian traditions versus the broader intellectual environment of the Islamic world. The interaction between these influences creates something unique. You continue walking and notice how certain themes repeat in the stories you hear. Honor, memory, connection to the land. These ideas feel deeply rooted, carried forward even as the form of expression changes. You begin to understand that identity is no longer only maintained through political systems or social structures. It is carried through language, through storytelling, through shared imagination. You walk along a path where travelers exchange not only goods but versus ideas, reflections. The road has become a channel for thought as much as for movement. This expands the reach of culture. You pause near a group reciting poetry under the soft light of evening. Their voices rise and fall gently, creating a rhythm that feels almost like the wind moving across the plateau you once walked. The connection is still there, even if the world has changed. Some researchers question whether this literary flowering helped preserve Persian identity during a time of political transformation, allowing it to remain distinct within a larger cultural framework. As you listen, it feels true. These words carry memory. They carry continuity. They carry identity forward. You stand and continue walking as the light fades further, the sky deepening into quiet tones. the sounds of voices soft and blending into the silhouette of at night. You realize that this moment is not about the rise of a new empire or the fall of an old one. It is about something quieter, more enduring, the shaping of identity through expression, through language that adapts without forgetting. You walk forward into the calm of the evening, carrying with you the understanding that Persia has not disappeared. It has found a new way to exist, in words, in memory, in the shared voice of those who continue to speak its story. You continue walking as the voice of the land, carried through language and memory, begins to take shape within new structures of power. The world around you is no longer defined by a single empire, but by many layers of authority that rise, shift, and settle over time. The land remains constant. The rulers change. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the early Islamic period, Persian lands were governed by a succession of dynasties, some local, some connected to large empires, yet many of them deeply influenced by Persian culture and administrative traditions. As you walk, you begin to feel this continuity beneath the change. You pass through a town where governance exists, but its form is different from what you have seen before. Authority is present, but it does not always feel centralized in the same way. Different regions carry different influences shaped by the dynasties that control them, and yet something familiar remains. The language spoken, the patterns of daily life, the quiet sense of identity that has persisted through each transformation. Some researchers question whether these dynasties should be seen as distinct breaks in history, or as part of a continuous thread of Persian influence that adapted to new political realities. You move through a marketplace where goods are exchanged as they have been for centuries. The objects may differ, routes may expand or contract, but the rhythm feels familiar. Trade continues, connection endures. You notice how officials manage local affairs, often using systems that echo earlier administrative practices. Records are kept, resources are tracked. Decisions are made with an awareness of both local needs and broader expectations. The structure evolves, but it does not disappear. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of Persian administrative knowledge was preserved and transmitted across these changing dynasties. Evidence suggests that many systems remained in use, adapted to fit new contexts. You walk toward a gathering where people discuss matters of governance. The tone is measured, thoughtful. Authority is recognized, but it is not always distant. There is interaction, negotiation, adjustment. This creates a different kind of stability. Not rigid, but responsive. You begin to sense that this period is defined by continuity within change. The land does not return to a single unified empire as before, but it does not lose its identity either. It exists within multiple frameworks. You continue walking along a road that has carried you through centuries of transformation. It still connects places, still supports movement, still allows ideas and goods to flow. The network persists. You pause and reflect on how this land has learned to adapt. Each new system builds upon what came before, even if it changes the form. Nothing is entirely erased, it is reshaped. Scholars remain divided about how unified Persian identity truly was during these centuries. While cultural elements remained strong, political fragmentation may have created variations in how that identity was experienced across regions. You walk through a settlement where different influences are visible at once. Architectural styles reflect multiple traditions. Clothing varies. Language carries layers of history. And yet there is coherence, a sense that all of these elements belong to the same evolving story. You begin to understand that identity here is not fixed. It is dynamic. It absorbs, adapts, and continues. You move toward the edge of the settlement as the light begins to soften once again. The evening brings a familiar calm, a gentle slowing of movement, a return to quiet. You think back to the earliest moments you experienced when identity was forming in small groups shaped by land and survival. Now that identity exists across centuries, across systems, across change, it has endured. Not by resisting change entirely, but by adapting to it. Some researchers question whether this adaptability is the defining feature of Persian identity, allowing it to persist through shifts that might have erased other cultures. As you stand there, it feels true. This land does not hold on to a single form. It evolves. You continue walking into the deepening evening, carrying with you the understanding that this continuity, this quiet persistence will shape what comes next, because change is not finished. It never is, and the story is still unfolding. You continue walking as the layered world you have been moving through begins to gather once again into something more defined. The shifting dynasties, the overlapping systems, the quiet continuity of culture all begin to align toward a new form of unity. It does not happen suddenly, but it becomes visible. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the early 16th century, a new dynasty known as the Safavid Empire emerged and reshaped the region into a more clearly defined state, one that began to resemble what we would later recognize as Iran. As you walk, you begin to feel the weight of that transformation. You move through a city where the atmosphere feels more focused, more unified. The structures are more deliberate, the symbols more consistent. There is a sense that identity is being shaped with intention. This is not just governance. It is definition. You notice how belief once again plays a central role, but now in a different way. The Safavid rulers established Shia Islam as the dominant religious framework, distinguishing their state from surrounding regions. This decision changes everything. It creates a clear boundary, not only political, but spiritual. Some researchers question whether this transformation was driven primarily by conviction or by strategy. Establishing a distinct religious identity could unify the population while also differentiating the state from powerful neighbors. As you walk, you see how this identity takes shape in daily life. Places of worship reflect shared practices. Rituals are observed with consistency. Symbols appear across the landscape, reinforcing a sense of unity. The land begins to feel more cohesive. You continue walking through a marketplace where goods from distant regions are still exchanged, but now within a framework that feels more distinctly local. The balance between connection and identity shifts. The world is still wide, but this place feels more defined within it. Archaeologists continue discussing how the Safavid transformation affected social structures. Did the emphasis on a unified religious identity create greater cohesion, or did it introduce new divisions within the population? As you observe, it feels like both forces are present. Unity strengthens the state, but it also creates lines between those who belong and those who do not. You walk toward a gathering where officials speak with clarity and purpose. Their authority is more centralized than what you have seen in recent centuries. Decisions flow from a recognized center, shaping the direction of the state. This is a return to strong structure, but with new meaning. You begin to understand that this moment represents one of the closest connections between the ancient idea of Persia and the emerging identity of Iran. Not the same, but linked. Scholars remain divided about how directly the Safavid state can be connected to earlier Persian empires. While it draws upon deep cultural traditions, it also introduces new elements that reshape those traditions into something distinct. You walk along a road that feels familiar in its function, connecting cities, carrying movement, sustaining the flow of life. But now the identity of the state is more clearly expressed along this path. The symbols are consistent, the message is unified. You begin to feel how this clarity strengthens the sense of belonging. People across different regions begin to see themselves as part of a shared entity, not just culturally but politically. This is something new. You pause and reflect on how far the journey has come, from scattered groups shaped by land, to empires that connected vast regions, to periods of blending and adaptation, and now to a state that defines itself with intention. You continue walking as the light begins to soften once again, the evening settling gently over a land that now feels both ancient and newly formed. There is strength here, but also complexity, because defining identity creates boundaries. And boundaries sometimes create tension. Some researchers question whether this moment of definition set the stage for future conflicts, both internal and external, by establishing a distinct identity in a region where many different traditions intersect. You begin to sense that possibility. The land feels unified, but not simple. You walk forward into the quiet of evening, carrying with you the understanding that this transformation is not the end of the story. It is another beginning, one that brings Persia closer to becoming something we now recognize. Iran, You continue walking as the newly defined state begins to settle into its identity, shaped not only by shared culture but by a clear sense of distinction from the world around it. The land feels more cohesive, more intentional, as though its boundaries are no longer just geographic but meaningful. You begin to notice how identity is now something people carry with awareness, not only through language or tradition, but through belief. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Safavid adoption of Shia Islam as a central element of the state helped distinguish it from neighbouring regions, many of which followed different interpretations of Islam. As you walk, you feel how this distinction shapes everyday life. You pass through a town where shared practices are visible in small, consistent ways. People gather at specific times. Rituals are observed with a sense of unity. There is a rhythm that connects individuals across distance, reinforcing a shared understanding of identity. This is not just belief, it is belonging. You notice how this belonging creates a stronger sense of cohesion. People who may have once identified primarily with local traditions now begin to see themselves as part of a larger whole, defined by shared belief and shared structure. This strengthens the state, but it also defines its edges. Some researchers question whether this emphasis on a distinct religious identity created long-term stability or introduced divisions that would shape future tensions. Defining who belongs can also define who does not. You walk along a road that now feels more clearly marked not only by physical structure, but by symbols that reflect the identity of the state. The land carries meaning in a way that is more visible than before. You begin to sense how this identity influences relationships beyond the borders. Interactions with neighbouring powers take on a new tone. There is not only political competition, but also a difference in belief that shapes how each side understands the other. This adds depth to rivalry. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period influenced the development of Iranian identity in the long term. The blending of political authority with a distinct religious framework created a foundation that would persist through later changes. You walk toward a gathering where people speak with quiet confidence about who they are and what they represent. Their words carry a sense of clarity that was not always present in earlier periods. Identity is no longer something that emerges slowly. It is something that is expressed. You begin to understand how powerful that can be. You move through a marketplace where trade continues, but the atmosphere feels more unified. Differences still exist, but they are framed within a shared structure that defines the space. This creates order. But also expectation. Scholars remain divided about how inclusive this identity was. While it created strong cohesion among those who shared it, it may have created challenges for those who existed outside its central framework. You notice how subtle distinctions appear in interactions in who participates fully and who remains at the edges. These differences are not always visible at first, but they are present. You begin to understand that identity shapes not only belonging but experience. You continue walking as the sun lowers, casting a soft light across the land. The atmosphere feels calm, but beneath that calm there is a sense of definition that did not exist before. This land now knows itself more clearly, and in knowing itself it defines its place in the world. You pause and reflect on how far the journey has come. The early communities you observed were shaped by survival, by adaptation to land. The empires that followed connected vast regions, blending cultures and systems. Now identity has become something more focused, more intentional, more visible. You begin to sense that this clarity will shape everything that follows. It will influence how the state responds to external pressures, how it adapts to change, how it maintains continuity. Some researchers question whether this strong sense of identity made the state more resilient or more rigid in the face of future transformations. The answer may depend on the challenges that lie ahead. You turn and continue walking into the quiet of evening, carrying with you the understanding that this moment of definition is both strength and tension, a foundation and a boundary. And as you move forward, you begin to feel that the next changes will test how this identity holds. You continue walking as the clarity of identity you have been sensing begins to meet something new, something that does not arise from within the land but arrives from beyond it. The structures still hold, the belief still binds, the sense of belonging remains strong, but pressure begins to gather, not suddenly, but c'est dead alive. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that from the 18th and 19th centuries onward, the region that had once been shaped by the Safavid Empire and its successors began to experience increasing influence from expanding European powers, particularly Russia and United Kingdom. As you walk, you begin to feel how different this kind of influence is. It does not always appear as direct control. It moves through trade, through agreements, through pressure applied quietly over time. You pass through a town where merchants discuss goods that now come from far beyond the familiar routes. Materials, technologies, and ideas arrive from distant places, carried not only by traders but by shifting global connections. The world is becoming larger, but also closer. Some researchers question whether these external influences were primarily economic opportunities or forms of control that gradually reshape local systems. Trade can connect, but it can also create dependency. You continue walking and notice how local leaders begin to engage with foreign representatives. Their conversations are carefully measured, agreements are discussed, terms negotiated. This is a different kind of interaction, not based on shared identity, but on competing interests. Archaeologists continue discussing how these external pressures affected internal stability. While the state maintained its identity, it also had to adapt to forces that operated on a scale beyond its traditional experience. You walk toward a gathering where maps are examined, not just of local regions, but of distant lands. The awareness of the world expands. People begin to understand that their place is part of a larger system of power. This changes perception. You begin to notice how this awareness introduces tension, not immediate, but present. There is a sense that decisions made far away can affect life here in ways that are difficult to control. You watch as goods are exchanged, but also as resources begin to move outward. Certain materials leave the land flowing toward distant markets. The balance of exchange begins to shift. This is subtle, but important. Scholars remain divided about how much agency local rulers retained during this period. While they continued to govern, their decisions were increasingly influenced by external pressures that shaped outcomes in ways that were not always visible. You continue walking and notice how daily life carries on, but with small changes. New items appear in homes. New ideas circulate in conversations. The world beyond the land begins to feel more present. You begin to understand that this is not a single event. It is a gradual process, a shift in how power operates. You walk along a road that now carries not only traditional trade, but also the influence of distant economies. The network has expanded beyond what you have seen before. The land is no longer only connected to itself. It is connected to the world. You pause and reflect on how this changes identity. The strong sense of belonging you observed earlier remains, but it now exists within a larger context. People must navigate not only internal structure, but external forces. This creates complexity. Some researchers question whether this period represents the beginning of modern challenges for the region where internal identity and external influence must be balanced carefully. As you stand there, it feels true. The land is still itself, but it is no longer isolated. You continue walking as the evening deepens, the light softening into quiet shadows. The town settles, the sounds fade, but the sense of change remains, not visible in every woman, but present in the direction of movement. You begin to sense that this growing pressure will lead to something more defined, not just influence, but transformation. And as you move forward into the calm of night, you carry with you the understanding that the next stage of this journey will bring the past and the present closer together than ever before. You continue walking as the quiet pressure you've been sensing begins to gather into something more visible, more immediate. The land still carries its long memory, its layered identity, but now the present feels closer, more urgent. The pace of change increases. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the region experienced growing internal tension as rulers struggled to balance tradition with the demands of modernization, particularly under dynasties like the Qajar dynasty. As you walk, you begin to feel that tension in the atmosphere. You pass through a city where the old and the new exist side by side in a way that feels less harmonious than before. Traditional structures still stand, but new elements appear among them. Different styles of clothing, new forms of communication, unfamiliar objects that reflect influence from beyond the region. The contrast is sharper, more noticeable. Some researchers question whether modernization during this period was driven by internal desire for reform or by external pressure that made change unavoidable. The distinction is difficult to separate as both forces often work together. You continue walking and notice how conversations carry a different tone. People speak of change not as a distant possibility, but as something happening now. There is curiosity, but also concern. What should be preserved? What should be changed? These questions begin to shape daily life. You move toward a gathering where individuals discuss governance, reform, and the future. Their voices are more animated than before. There is disagreement, debate, a sense that different paths are possible. This is new. Archaeologists continue discussing how this period of reform influenced the development of modern political thought in the region. The introduction of new ideas about governance, representation, and rights began to reshape how people understood authority. You watch as individuals exchange ideas that feel unfamiliar within the older systems. Concepts of participation, of shared decision-making, of limiting power begin to appear. These ideas do not replace the existing structure immediately. They challenge it. You begin to understand that this moment is not only about external influence, it is about internal questioning. Scholars remain divided about how unified the desire for reform was across different groups. While some pushed strongly for change, others sought to preserve existing traditions, creating tension within society. You continue walking and notice how this tension appears in subtle ways. Some areas embrace new practices more quickly. Others hold tightly to established patterns. The land begins to feel divided, not physically but in direction. You walk along a street where traditional life continues, but just beyond it, new forms of organization are taking shape. Institutions, yes, then system and expectations begin to be old. The old order is still present, but it is no longer unquestioned. You pause and reflect on how far the journey has come. From early survival shaped by land, to empires that connected vast regions, to identity formed through belief and culture, and now to a moment where that identity is being reconsidered. You begin to sense that this is one of the most delicate stages. Change is no longer gradual. It is debated, chosen, resisted. Some researchers question whether this period set the foundation for modern Iran, or if it represents a disruption that challenged long-established continuity. The answer may depend on how these changes are understood. You continue walking as the evening settles, the light softening across a city that feels both familiar and uncertain. There is movement here, not of armies or trade, but of ideas, of decisions, of direction. You begin to feel that the structures you have been following for centuries are approaching a point where they can no longer remain as they are. Something must change. And as you walk forward into the quiet of night, you carry with you the understanding that the next moment will not be shaped slowly. It will come with force, with clarity, and with consequences that will reshape everything you have seen. You continue walking as the tension you have been sensing gathers into something unmistakable. The quiet debates, the slow adjustment, the gradual questioning of old structures now begin to move toward a single point. Not sudden, but concentrated. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the 20th century, under the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty, efforts to modernize the country intensified, reshaping society, governance, and daily life in ways that reached deeply into the identity of the land. As you walk through the city, you feel how different this moment is from anything before. The pace is faster, the change is more visible. You pass through streets where traditional life continues, but alongside it new structures rise. Buildings designed with unfamiliar styles. Systems introduced that reflect ideas from distant parts of the world. The contrast is no longer subtle. It is immediate. Some researchers question whether these reforms were necessary steps toward modernization, or whether they moved too quickly, creating tension between past and present. Change can strengthen, but it can also disrupt. You continue walking and notice how people respond in different ways. Some move forward with the changes, adapting quickly. embracing new opportunities. Others hesitate, holding on to familiar patterns, uncertain of what may be less untold. This creates division, not always visible, but present. You walk toward a gathering where voices are raised not in chaos, but in intensity. People speak of identity, of direction, of what the future should look like. Their words carry weight shaped by centuries of history that now feel close immediate. This is not just about policy. It is about meaning. Archaeologists continue discussing how modernization affected social structures, particularly how it shifted relationships between authority, tradition, and everyday life. The balance that once held the land together becomes harder to maintain. You begin to feel how pressure builds. The structures that once provided stability now feel strained. Expectations change, roles shift. The sense of continuity that carried through centuries begins to feel uncertain. You walk along a street where signs of both worlds exist side by side. Traditional clothing and modern attire, old practices and new systems. The contrast is sharp. You begin to understand that this moment is not just a continuation of change. It is a confrontation between different visions of identity. Scholars remain divided about how much control the Pahlavi rulers had over the direction of change versus how much was shaped by their external influence and internal resistance. The forces at play are complex, intertwined. You continue walking as the atmosphere grows heavier, not in sound but in feeling. Conversations become more focused, movements more deliberate. The sense that something is approaching becomes undeniable. You feel it in the air, a turning point. You move toward a gathering where the energy shifts. The voices are no longer only discussing change. They are demanding it. You begin to sense how years of pressure, of adaptation, of tension between old and new now converge into a single direction. This is how transformation happens, not all at once, but through accumulation. Some researchers question whether the events that follow are inevitable, or if different choices could have led to a different outcome. History often feels clear in retrospect, but uncertain in the moment. You walk through the city as the light begins to fade, casting long shadows across streets that now feel charged with anticipation. The structures remain. The systems still function. But something is breaking, not visibly yet, but internally. You pause and look around. The land you have followed through centuries of change now stands at the edge of something that will reshape it once again, not through gradual adaptation, but through sudden transformation. You begin to understand that everything you have seen, every layer of identity, every system of power, every adaptation has led to this moment. And as you take a final step forward into the deepening evening, you feel the shift begin. You continue walking as the tension you have felt begins to resolve not into calm, but into change that cannot be held back any longer. The streets you move through feel familiar yet different. The patterns of life still exist, but they no longer carry the same certainty. Something is unfolding. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in 1979, a revolution transformed the country, ending the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty and establishing a new political system that would reshape the identity of the nation into what is now known as modern Iran. As you walk, it does not feel like a single moment. It feels like release. The voices you heard earlier, once cautious, now become clear. People gather with purpose, movement increases. The quiet tension that built over years begins to express itself openly. You observe not chaos, but direction. A shift that has been forming now moves forward. Some researchers question whether the revolution was driven primarily by political dissatisfaction, cultural resistance, economic factors, or a combination of all three. The complexity of its causes reflects the layered history you have walked through. You continue moving through the city and notice how quickly the atmosphere changes. Symbols shift, language changes, the way people speak about authority, about identity, about the future transforms. This is not just a change in leadership, it is a change in meaning. You begin to understand that the name Iran now carries everything you have seen. Not only the ancient empires, not only the layers of belief and culture, but also the choices made in this moment. Archaeologists and historians continue discussing how much of ancient Persian identity remains visible within modern Iran and how much has been reshaped by more recent history. The connection is not always direct, but it is present. You walk along a street where people move with a sense of clarity even as uncertainty remains. The old structures have shifted, new ones are forming. The balance between past and present is being renegotiated. And yet something feels familiar. The resilience you observed in the earliest communities, the adaptability that carried through empires and transformations. It is still here. You begin to sense that this is what connects everything. Not a single system, not a single identity, but a continuous ability to change without losing something essential. Scholars remain divided about how to define modern Iranian identity. Is it a continuation of ancient Persia, a product of Islamic civilization, or something entirely new shaped by modern history? The answer may exist in all of these at once. You slow your pace as the evening deepens, the sounds of the city softening the movement, becoming less intense. The energy of change settles into something quieter. You look around and see layers, ancient patterns beneath modern streets, old ideas carried within new language. A past that has not disappeared but transformed. You begin to understand that Persia did not become Iran in a single moment. It became Iran through thousands of years of adaptation, through survival, through connection, through change. You take a final step forward and allow the world around you to soften. The city fades slightly, its edges less defined. The sounds become quieter. The movement slows until it feels like a gentle rhythm, dangerous rather than urgency. The land remains, the identity remains, but now it rests. You imagine the plateau you first walked wide and silent shape by wind and time. You imagine the early communities, the first alliances, the rise of empires, the blending of cultures, the shaping of belief. All of it still exists, not in the same form, but in memory. In language, in the quiet continuity that carries through generations, the light dims further, becoming soft, distant, almost like a memory itself. You no longer feel the need to walk, you simply remain, present, aware, at ease. The long journey settles into stillness, and as the night deepens, the story gently fades, not ending but resting, ready to continue in another time, another place, another quiet moment of reflection. End of script. Sweet dreams.